Friendos, it is I, that Dante, that D4NT3, and today we are going to be reading the Scarlet Gospels by Clive Barker. A few short announcements. That Dante, that D4NT3 on Twitter. I have a Discord up. You should see a link shortly in your streaming service, I think. Unless you're on Periscope, I don't think I'm transmitting. Not my fault, but I don't think I'm transmitting that stuff to Periscope, so sorry, Periscope people. If you want to hang out there, it's all good. Got a text lounge. If you're more into the podcast-like experience, got a voice channel in there where I'm pretty much just, doing what I'm doing here. So that's a thing. And I think that's about it. We're going to do that, and if I have time left over today, we're going to do some French learning. Keep that going. See what I remember. Anyway, let's carry on to this story. This is the Scarlet Gospels by Clive Barker, as you can see on the screen there. And I think this is like the last part of the story that involves Hellraiser. So let's get it going. After the long quiet of the grave, Joseph Rogowski gave voice, and it was not pleasant in either sound or sentiment. "Look at you all," he said, scrutinizing the 5 magicians who'd woken him from his dreamless sleep. "You look ghostly, every one of you." "You don't look so good yourself, Joe," Lily Saffro said. Your embalmer was a little too enthusiastic with the rouge and the eyeliner." Rogowski snarled, his hand going up to his cheek and wiping off some of the makeup that had been used to conceal the sickening pallor his violent death had left on him. He'd been hastily embalmed, no doubt, and filed away in his ledge within the family mausoleum in a cemetery on the outskirts of Hamburg. "I'm up on chat if you want to chat, or if you want to lurk, it's all good." "I hope you didn't go to all this trouble just to take cheap shots at me," Rogowski said, surveying the paraphernalia that littered the floor around him. "Regardless, I'm impressed. Necromantic workings demanded an obsessive's eyeball for detail. The Ngai's working, which was the one the magicians had used to raise Rogowski, called for the eggs of pure white doves that had been injected with the blood of a girl's first menstruation, to be cracked into 11 alabaster bowls surrounding the corpse, each of which contained other obscure ingredients. Purity was of the essence of this working. The birds couldn't be speckled, the blood had to be fresh, and the 2,709 numerals that were inscribed in black chalk, starting beneath the ring of bowls and spiraling inward to the spot where the corpse of the resurrectee was laid, had to be in precisely the right order, with no erasures, breaks, or corrections. This is your work, isn't it, Elizabeth?" Rogowski said. The oldest of the 5 magicians, Elizabeth Kotlov, a woman whose skills in some of the most complex and volatile of magical preservations weren't enough to keep her face from looking like someone who'd lost both her appetite and her ability to sleep decades ago, nodded. "Yes," she said, "we need your help, Joey." "It's a long time since you called me that," Rogowski said, "and it was usually when you were fucking me. Am I being fucked right now?" Kotlov threw a quick glance at her fellow magicians, Lily Saffro, Yashar Hayadat, Arnold Potash, and Theodore Felixson, and saw that they were no more amused by Rogowski's insults than she was. "I see that death hasn't robbed you of your bitter tongue," she said. "For fuck's sake," said Poltash. "This has been the problem all along. Whatever we did or didn't do, whatever we had or didn't have, none of it matters," he shook his head. "The time we wasted fighting to outdo one another, when we could have been working together, it makes me want to weep." "You weep," said Theodore Felixson. "I'll fight." "Yes, please, spare us your tears, Arnold," Lily said. She was the only one of the 5 summoners sitting, for the simple reason that she was missing her left leg. "We all wish we could change things." "Lily, dear," Rogowski said, "I can't help but notice that you're not quite the woman you were. What's happened to your leg?" "Actually," she said, "I got lucky. He nearly had me, Joseph." "He? You mean he hasn't been stopped?" "We're a dying breed, Joseph," said Poltash. "A veritable endangered species. How many of the circle are left? Joseph said, a sudden urgency in his voice. There was a silence while the five exchanged hesitant looks. It was Kotlov who finally spoke. We are all that is left, she said, staring at one of the alabaster bowls and its blood-stained contents. You? 5? No. All the sarcasm and the petty game-playing had gone from Rogowski's voice and manner. Even the embalmer's bright paints could not moderate the horror on Rogowski's face. Let me check. Do some crap here. How long have I been dead? Oh, wait. Even the embalmer's... Okay. How long have I been dead? 3 years, Kotlov said. This has to be a joke. How is this possible? Rogowski said. There were 271 in the high circle alone. Yes, said Hayadat. Hey, Penguin Zamim. And that's only those who chose to be counted among us. Oh. Hold on one second. There's something I need to add to my little stream here. Cute. Okay. I am reading, not doing Italian cuss words, penguin. Or pinguis. Pingus. Okay. I was looking for something. Oh, I'm going to have to pull it from... Here. Switching real quick. That's what I'm looking for. Always something to do that I've forgotten to do. Always something. Alright, so let's take this guy. There we go. That's what I like to see. All right. Okay, so back to the story. How long have I been dead? 3 years, Kotlov said. This has to be a joke. How is that possible? Rogowski said. There were 271 in the high circle alone. Yes, said Hayadat. And that's only those who chose to be counted among us. There's no telling how many he took from outside the circles. Hundreds? Thousands? And no telling what they owned either, Lily Safro said. We had a reasonably thorough list, but even that wasn't complete, Poltash said. We all have our secret possessions. I know I do. Ah, too true, Felixson said. 5, Rogowski said, shaking his head. Why couldn't you put your heads together and work out some way to stop him? That's why we went to all the trouble of bringing you back, Hayadat said. Believe me, none of us did it happily. You think we didn't try to catch the bastard? We fucking tried. But the demon is goddamn clever. And getting cleverer all the time, Kotlov said. In a way, you should be flattered. He took you early because he'd done his homework. He knew you were the only one who could unite us against him. And when you died, we argued and pointed fingers like squabbling schoolchildren, Poltash sighed. He picked us off, one by one, moving all over the globe so we never knew where he was going to strike next. A lot of people got taken without anybody knowing a thing about it. We'd hear about it later, usually after a few months, sometimes even a year. Just by chance, you'd try to make contact with someone and find their house had been sold or burned to the ground or simply left to rot. I visited a couple of places like that. Remember Brander's house in Bali? I went there, and Dr. Biganazzoli's place outside of Rome? I went there too. There was no sign of any looting. The locals were far too afraid of what they'd heard about the occupants to take a step inside either house, even despite the fact that it was very obvious that nobody was home. What did you find? Rogowski said. Poltash took out a pack of cigarettes and lit one as he went on. His hands were trembling, and it took some help from Kotlov to steady the hand that held his lighter. Everything of any magical value had vanished. Brander's ear texts, Bigonzoli's collection of Vatican Apocrypha. Everything down to the most trivial blasphemous pamphlet was gone. The shelves were bare. It was obvious that Brander had put up a struggle. There was a lot of blood in the kitchen, of all places. Do we really have to go back over all this? Haydat said. We all know how these stories end. You dragged me out of a very welcome death to help save your souls, Rogowski said. The least you can do is let me hear the facts, Arnold continued. Well, the blood was old. There was a lot of it, but it had dried many months before. Was it the same with Bigonzoli? Rogowski said. Bigonzoli's place was still sealed up when I visited. Shutters closed and doors locked as if he'd gone on a long vacation, but he was still inside. I found him in his study. Christ Joseph, he was hanging from the ceiling by chains. They were attached to hooks that had been put through his flesh, and it was so hot in there. My guess is he'd been dead in that dry heat for at least 6 months. His body was completely withered up, but the expression on his face could have just been the way the flesh had retreated from around his mouth as it dried up. But by God, he looked as though he died screaming. He tried screaming. Rogowski studied the faces before him. So while you were having your private wars over mistresses and boys, this demon ended the lives and pillaged the minds of the most sophisticated magicians on the planet? In sum, Poltesh said, yes. Why? What is his intention? Have you at least discovered that? The same as ours, we think, Felixson said. The getting and keeping of power. He hasn't just taken our treaties, scrolls, and grimoires. He's cleared out all the vestments, all the talismans, all the amulets. Hush, Rogowski said suddenly. Listen. There was a silence among them for a moment, and then a funeral bell chimed softly in the distance. Oh, Christ, Lily said. It's his bell. The dead man laughed. He's found you. The assembled company, accepting the once deceased Rogowski, instantly loosed a flood of prayers, protestations, and entreaties, no two of which were in the same language. Thank you for the gift of second life, old friends, Rogowski said. Few people get the pleasure of dying twice, especially by the same executioner. Rogowski stepped out of his coffin, kicked over the first of the alabaster bowls, and began working his way around the necromantic circle in a counterclockwise direction. The broken eggs in the menstrual blood, along with the other ingredients of the bowls, each one different but all a vital part of the Nengi's working, were spilled across the floor. One bowl rolled off on its rim, weaving wildly before hitting one of the mausoleum walls. That was just childish, Kotlov said. Sweet Jesus, Poltash said. The bell's getting louder. We made our peace with one another to get your help and protect ourselves, Felixson said. Surrender can't be our only option. I won't accept it. You made your peace too late, Rogowski said, bringing his foot down and grinding the broken bowls into powder. Maybe if there had been 50 of you all sharing your knowledge, you might have had a hope. But as it stands, you're outnumbered. Outnumbered? You mean he has functionaries? Haydat said. Good God, is it the fog of death or the years that have passed? I honestly don't remember you people being this stupid. The demon has imbibed the knowledge of countless minds. He doesn't need backup. There's not an incantation in existence that can stop him. It can't be true, screamed Felixson. I'm sure I would have said the same hopeless thing 3 years ago, but that was before my untimely demise, Brother Theodore. We should disperse, Haydat said, all in different directions. I'll head to Paris. You're not listening, Yashar. It's too late, Rogowski said. You can't hide from him. I'm proof. You're right, said Haydat. Paris is too obvious. Somewhere more remote, then. While Haydat laid his panicked plans, Elizabeth Kotlov apparently resigned to the reality of her circumstances. Took the time to speak conversationally with Rogowski. They said they found your body in the temple of Femestrian. It seems an odd place for you to be, Joseph. Did he bring you there? Rogowski stopped and looked at her for a moment before saying, No, it was my own hiding place, actually. There was a room behind the altar, tiny, dark. I thought I was safe. And he found you anyway. Rogowski nodded. Then, trying to keep his tone offhand and failing, he said, How did I look? I wasn't there, but by all accounts appalling. He'd left you in your little hidey hole with his books still in you. With his hooks still in you. Did you tell him where all your manuscripts were? Poltash asked. With a hook and chain up through my asshole, pulling my stomach down into my bowels, yes, Arnold, I did. I squealed like a rat in a trap, and then he left me there with that chain slowly disemboweling me, until he'd gone to my house and brought back everything I'd hidden. I wanted so badly to die by that time. I remember that I literally begged him to kill me. I gave him information he didn't even ask for. All I wanted was death, which I got, finally, and I was never grateful for anything in my life, more grateful for anything in my life. Jesus wept, Felixson yelled out. Look at it, you all, listening to his babble. We raised the son of a bitch to get some answers, not recount his fucking horror stories. You want answers? Rogowski snapped. Here then, get yourself some paper and write down the whereabouts of every last grimoire, pamphlet, and article of power you own. Everything. He's going to get the information anyway, sooner or later. You, Lily, you have the only known copy of Sanderiger's cruelties, yes? Maybe. For fuck's sake, woman, Poltesh said. He's trying to help. Yes, I own it, Lily Saffro said. It's in a safe buried below my mother's coffin. Write it down. The address of the cemetery, the position of the plot. Draw a goddamn blueprint if you have to. Just make it easy for him. Hopefully he'll return the favor. I have no paper, Haidat said, his voice suddenly shrill and boyish with fear. Somebody give me a piece of paper. Here, said Elizabeth, tearing a sheet from an address book she pulled out of her pocket. Poltash was writing on an envelope which he had pressed up against the marble wall of the mausoleum. I don't see how this saves us from his tampering with our brains, he said, scribbling furiously. It doesn't, Arnold. It's merely a gesture of humility. Something none of us have been very familiar with in our lives. But it may, and I make no guarantees, it may hold sway. Oh, Christ, said Haidat. I see light between the cracks. The magicians glanced up from their scrawling to see what he was talking about. At the far end of the mausoleum, a cold blue light was piercing the fine cracks between the marble blocks. Our visitor's imminent, said Rogowski. Elizabeth, dear? Joseph, she said, failing to glance up from her fevered scribbling. Release me, will you, please? In a minute. Let me finish writing. Release me, goddamn you, he said. I don't want to be here when he comes. I don't ever want to see that horrible face of his again. Patience, Joseph, Poltash said. We're only heeding your advice. Someone give me back my death. I can't go through this again. Nobody should have to. The swelling light from beyond the mausoleum wall was now accompanied by a grinding sound as one of the enormous marble blocks, at about head height, slowly pushed itself out of the wall. When it was roughly 10 inches clear of the wall, a second block, below and to the left of the first one, began to move. Seconds later, a third, this time to the right and above the first, also began shifting. The glittering silver-blue shafts of light that had begun this unknitting came in wherever there was a crack for them to steal through. Rogowski, enraged at the indifference of his resurrectors, resumed the destruction of Kotlov's necromantic labors where he'd left off. He grabbed the alabaster bowls and hurled them against the moving wall. Then, pulling off the jacket he'd been buried in, he got down on his knees and used it to scrub out the numbers Kotlov had scrawled into the immaculate spiral. Dead though he was, beads of fluid appeared on his brow as he scrubbed. It was a dark, thick liquid that collected at his forehead and finally fell from his face and spattered on the ground, a mingling of the embalming fluid and some remnants of his own corrupted juices. But his effort to undo the resurrection began to pay off. A welcome numbness started spreading from his fingers and toes up into his limbs, and a lolling weight gathered behind his eyes and sinuses, as the semi-liquefied contents of his skull responded to the demands of gravity. Glancing up from his work, he saw the 5 magicians scrawling madly like students racing to finish a vital examination paper before the tolling of the bell. Except, of course, the price of failure was rather worse than a bad mark. Rogowski's gaze went from their toil to the wall, where 6 blocks were now on the move. The first of the 6 marble blocks that had responded to the pressure from the other side finally slid clear of the wall and dropped to the ground. A shaft of frigid light lent solidity by the marble cement dust that hung in the air. From the unseated block, spilled from the hole and across the length of the mausoleum, striking the opposite wall. The second block dropped only moments later. Theodore Felixson began to pray aloud as he wrote the divinity at his prayer's destination, usefully ambiguous. Thine the power, thine the judgment, take my soul, Lord, shape it and use it. I am weak, Lord, I am fearful. It's not another lord we need in here, Elizabeth said. It's a goddess. And so saying, she began her own entreaty. Honey-breasted art thou, Neitha. Call me daughter, I will suckle. While Felixen continued the thread of his own prayer. Save me, Lord, from fear and darkness. Hold me fast against your heart, Lord. Hayadet interrupted this battle of supplications with a bellow that only a man of his considerable proportions could have unleashed. I never heard such naked hypocrisy in my life. When did you two ever have faith in anything besides your own covetousness? If the demon can hear you, he's laughing. You're wrong, said a voice from the place out of which the cold light came. The words, though in themselves unremarkable, seemed to escalate the wall's capitulation. 3 more blocks began to grind their way forward while another 2 dropped out of the wall. Oh, wait, let me do some stuff. What is it? Is it that? Enjoying the debris accruing on the mausoleum floor. The unseen speaker continued to address the magicians. His voice, with its glacial severity, oh lordy, made the harsh light seem tropical by contrast. I smell decaying flesh, the demon said, but with a quickening perfume. Someone has been raising the dead. Yet more of the blocks toppled to the ground, so that now there would have been a hole in the wall, large enough to allow the entrance of a man of some stature, except for the fact that rubble blocked the lower third of the space. For the entity about to make its entrance, however, such matters were easily resolved. Ovat Porak, it said. The order was obeyed instantly. The rubble, listening intently, divided in a heartbeat. Even the air itself was cleansed for him, for as he spoke, every particle of cement dust was snatched from his path. And thus, his way unhindered, the Cenobite entered into the presence of the 6 magicians. He was tall, looking very much as he did in the volumes of notable demons that the magicians had pored over in recent months and weeks, vainly looking for some hint of frailty in the creature. They had found none, of course, but now as he appeared in the flesh, there was a distinct sense of humanity in his being, of the man he had been once, before the monstrous labors of his order had been performed. His flesh was virtually white, his hairless head ritualistically scarred with deep grooves that ran both horizontally and vertically, at every intersection of which a nail had been hammered through the bloodless flesh and into his bone. Perhaps at one time the nails had gleamed, but the years had tarnished them. No matter, for the nails possessed a certain elegance, enhanced by the way the demon held his head, as though regarding the world with an air of wary condescension. Whatever torments he had planned for these last victims, and his knowledge of pain and its mechanism would have made the inquisitors look like schoolyard bullies. It would be worsened by orders of magnitude if any one of them dared utter that irreverent nickname, Pinhead, the origins of which were long lost in claim and counterclaim. As for the rest of his appearance, it was much as it had been depicted in the etchings and woodcuts of demonic listings for millennia. The black vestments, the hem of which brushed the floor, the patches of skinned flesh exposing blood-beaded muscle, and the skin tightly interwoven with the fabric of his robes. There had always been debates as to whether the damned soul who wore this mask of pain and its accompanying vestments was a single man who'd lived many human lifetimes, or whether the order of the gash passed the scars and nails on to another soul after the labors of temptation had exhausted their present possessor. There was certainly evidence for either belief in the state of the demon before them. He looked like a creature that had lived too long, his eyes set in bruised pools, his gait steady but slow. But the tools that hung from his belt, an amputation saw, a trepanning drill, a small chisel, and 3 silver syringes were, like the abattoir worker's chainmail apron he wore, I'm not sure if I said that word right, wet with blood. Confirmation that his wariness did not apparently keep him from taking a personal hand in the practicalities of agony. He brought flies with him, too, fat, blue-black flies in their thousands. Many buzzed around his waist, alighting on the instruments to take their share of wet human meat. They were 4 or 5 times the size of terrestrial flies, and their busy noise echoed around the mausoleum. The demon stopped, regarding Rogowski with some resembling curiosity. Joseph Rogowski, the Cenobite said, your suffering was sweet, but you died too soon. It pleases me to see you standing here." Rogowski tensed. "Do your worst, demon." "I have no need to pillage your mind a second time." He turned and faced the 5 quivering magicians. "It's these 5 I came to catch. More for closure than the hope of revelation. I've been to magic's length and breadth. I've explored its outermost limits, and rarely, very rarely, I've mined the thoughts of a truly original thinker. If, as Whitehead said, all philosophy is footnotes to Plato, then all magic is footnotes to 12 great texts. Texts I now possess." Lily Sappho had started to hyperventilate a little way into the demon's speech, and now reached into her purse, digging frantically through its chaotic elements. "My pills! Oh, Jesus, where are my pills?" In her jittery state, she lost her grip on one end of her purse, and its contents fell out, spreading across the floor. She went to her knee, found the bottle, and snatched up her pills, oblivious to everything but getting them into her mouth. She chewed and swallowed the large white tablets like candies, staying on the ground, clutching her chest and taking deep breaths. Felixson spoke, ignoring her panicked outburst. "I have 4 safes." Oh, sorry, that was not the demon. That's him, Felixson. "I have 4 safes," he told the demon. "I've written down their whereabouts and their codes. If that's too much trouble for you, I'll fetch them myself. Or you could accompany me. It's a big house. You might like it. Cost me $18 million. It's yours. You and your brethren are welcome to it." "My brethren," the Cenobite said. "Apologies, there are sisters in your order too. I was forgetting that. Well, I'm sure I own enough works for you to pass around. I know you said you've got all the magic texts, but I do have a few very fine first editions. Nearly perfect, most of them." Before the demon could respond to this, Hayat said, "Your lordship, or is it your grace, your holiness?" "Master." Like a dog?" Hayat said. "Surely," Felix said, wanting desperately to please the demon. "If he says we're dogs, then dogs we are." "Well stated," the demon. I'm trying to get into these voices. "Well stated," the demon said. "But words are easy. Down, dog." Felixson waited for a moment, hoping this had just been a throwaway remark, but it was not. "I said down," the Cenobite warned. Felixson began to kneel. The demon went on. "And naked. Dogs go naked, surely." "Oh, yes, of course, naked." Felixson proceeded to undress. "And you," the demon said, extending his pale finger toward Kotlov. "Elizabeth Kotlov. Be his bitch. Naked as well. On your hands and knees." Without further prompting, she started to unbutton her blouse. But he said, "Wait," and walked toward her, the flies rising up from their blood-clotted dining places as he moved. Elizabeth flinched, but the demon merely reached out and placed his hand on her lower belly. "How many abortions have you had, woman? I count 11 here." That's right," she stuttered. "Most wombs would not survive such unkindness." He clenched his fists, and Elizabeth let out a little gasp. "But even at your advanced age, I can give your abused womb the capacity to finally do what it was made to do." "No," Elizabeth said, more in disbelief than denial. "You couldn't." "The child will be here soon." Elizabeth was out of words. She simply stared at the demon as though she could somehow make him take pity on her. Now, he said, "be a good bitch and get down on all fours." "May I say something?" Poltest said. "You may try." I could be very useful to you. I mean, my circle of influence reaches to Washington." "What is your offer?" "I am simply saying there are a lot of people in high office who owe their positions to me. I can make them report to you with a single phone call. It's not magical power, I grant you, but you seem to have all you need of that." "What are you asking in return?" "Just my life. Then you name the names in Washington you need at your feet, and I'll make it happen." The Cenobite didn't reply. His attention had been claimed by the sight of Felixson, who was standing in his underwear, with Elizabeth beside him, still preserving her modesty. "I said it naked," the demon snapped. "Both of you. Look at that belly of yours, Elizabeth. How it swells. What about those tired tits? How do they look now?" He pulled off the remains of her blouse and the brassiere beneath. The dry purses of her breast were indeed growing fuller. "You'll do for one more breeding, and this time you won't be scraping it out of your womb." "What do you think of my offer?" Poltash asked, vying for the demon's attention. But before the demon could respond, Haida interrupted. "He's a liar," he said. "He's more of a palm reader than an advisor." "Shut your fucking mouth, Hayadat," Poltash said. Hayadat continued, "I know for a fact that Washington prefers the woman Sidikaro." "Ah, yes, I have her reminiscences," the demon said, tapping his temple. "And you pass it all on to your order, right?" Hayadat inquired. "Do I? Surely the other members of your order are not with me." Hayadat blanched, suddenly understanding. "You're acting alone." Hayadat's revelation was interrupted by a moan from Elizabeth Kotlov, who was now on all four, besides the Cenobite's other dog, Theodore Felixson. Her belly and breasts were now round and ripe, the Cenobite's influence powerful enough to already have her nipples leaking milk. "Don't let that go to waste," the Cenobite said to Felixson. "Put your face to the floor and lick it up." As Felixson too eagerly bent to his task, Poltash, who had apparently lost all confidence in his offer, made a mad dash for the door. He was 2 strides short of the threshold when the Cenobite threw a look into the passageway from which he'd come. Something glittering and serpentine there sped from the other side of the wall, crossed into the chamber, and caught Poltash in the back of his neck. A beat later, 3 more came after it. Chains. All of them ending in what looked like hooks big enough to catch sharks, wrapping themselves around Poltash at the neck, chest, and waist. Poltash shrieked with pain. The Hell Priest listened to the sound the man made with the attentiveness of a connoisseur. "Shrill and inexpensive. I expected better from the one who lasted this long." The chains rented themselves in 3 different directions, trisecting Poltash in the blink of an eye. For a moment the magician stood there looking dazed, and then his head rolled off his neck and hit the mausoleum floor with a sickening plop. Seconds later, his body followed after, spilling his steaming intestines and stomach along with their half-digested contents onto the ground. The demon raised his nose and inhaled, taking in the aroma. "Better." Then a tiny gesture from the Cenobite, and the chains that had ended Poltash's life snaked across the floor and slithered up the door, wrapping themselves around the handle. Tightening themselves, they pulled the door closed and raised their hooked heads like a trinity of cobras ready to strike, dissuading any further attempts at escape. "Some things are better done in private, don't you think, Joseph? Do you remember how it was for us? You offered to be my personal assassin, and then you shit yourself." "Aren't you a little tired of all this by now?" Rogowski replied. "How much suffering can you cause before it fails to give you whatever sad, sick thing it is you need?" "Each to their own. You went through a phase when you wouldn't touch a girl over 13. "Will you just do it already?" Rogowski said. "Soon. You are the last. After you, there'll be no more games. Only war." "War," said Rogowski. "There'll be nobody left to fight." "I see death has not made a wise man of you, Joseph. Did you really think this was all about your pitiful secret society?" "What then?" Hayadat asked. "If I'm to die, I'd like to know the reason." The demon turned. Hayadat looked into the shiny darkness of his eyes, and as if in answer to Hayadat's question, the Cenobite spat a word in the direction of the open wall. A flight of 20 hooks, trailed by glinting chains, came at Hayadat, catching him everywhere: mouth, throat, breasts, belly, groin, legs, feet, and hands. The Cenobite was bypassing the torture and interrogation and going straight to the execution. Lost in his agonies, Hayadat babbled as the hooks steadily worked themselves deeper into his 350-pound body. It was hard to make much sense of what he was saying through the snot and the tears, but he seemed to be listing the books in his collection, as though he might still be able to strike a bargain with the beast. "The Via Kizor Diallo, the only remaining of Ghaffari's null." The Cenobite then called 7 more chains into play, which came swiftly, sweeping around Hayadat from all directions. They hooked themselves into his shuddering body and wrapped themselves so tightly that the fat man's flesh oozed from between the rusted links. Lily edged herself into her corner and covered her face with her hands. The others, even Kotlov, who appeared now to be 8 months into her term while Felix hammered at her from behind, looked up as Hayadat continued to chatter and sob. Mazov's names of infernal territories. All 27 chains had now secured themselves into the man's body. The Cenobite murmured another order, and the chains proceeded to tighten further, pulling on Hayadat's body from several directions. Even now, with flesh and bone under unbearable stress, he continued to list his treasures. Oh God, Lomp's Symphony, the Death Symphony, Romeo Refra's Yellow Knight, Rogowski prompted. He was watching Headed Torment with a dispassion perhaps only a dead man could have worn. Yes, and Hayadat started to say. There the list stopped, however, as Hayadat, only now comprehending what was happening to him, unleashed a stream of pleading cries, all rising in volume as his body was subjected to the contrary demands of the hooks. His body could not withstand the claims made upon it any longer. His skin began to tear, and he started to thrash wildly, his last coherent words, his entreaties, overtaken by the ragged howls of agony that he now unleashed. His belly flesh succumbed first. The hook there had gone deep. It ripped away a wedge of bright yellow fat 10 inches thick and some of the muscle beneath. His breasts came next, skin and fat followed by blood. Even Lily watched now through her fingers as the spectacle escalated. The hook in Hayadat's left leg, which had centered behind his shin bone, broke it with a crack that was loud enough to be audible above Hayadat's screams. His ears came off with the scraps of scalp attached. His shoulder blades were both broken as the hooks there pulled themselves free. But despite the thrashing, the screams, and the reflecting pool of black blood below his body, now so large it lapped against the hem of the Cenobite's vestments, the demon was not satisfied. He issued new instructions, using one of the oldest tricks in magic. This is German. Teufelsprach. He whispered instructions, and 3 new hooks, larger than any that had come before, their outer edges sharp as scalpels, flew at the exposed fat and flesh of Hayadat's chest and stomach and sliced their way into his interior. The effect of one of the 3 was immediate. It pierced his left lung. His screaming stopped, and he began to gasp for air, his thrashing becoming desperate convulsions. Thanks for the follow, salty boy. Finish him in mercy's name, Rogowski said. The Cenobite turned his back on his victim and faced Rogowski. The demon's cold, lifeless stare caused even Rogowski's stiff, reanimated flesh to prickle. Hayadat was the last... it's the demon. Hayadat was the last man to give me orders. You would do well not to follow in his footsteps. Somehow, even after experiencing the hand of death itself, Rogowski still found himself afraid of the calculating demon who stood before him. Where was I? There. Taking a deep breath, Rogowski conjured what courage he could. What are you trying to prove? Do you think if you kill enough people, in the worst ways imaginable, they'll give you a name like the Madman or the Butcher? It doesn't matter how many abhorrent torturers you devise, you'll always be the Pinhead. The air went still. The Cenobite's lip curled. Quick as a flash, he reached out for Rogowski, seized the dead man's scrawny throat, and pulled him close. Without taking his black gaze off of Rogowski for an instant, the demon lifted his trephine from his belt, activating the device with his thumb as he brought it to the middle of Rogowski's upper brow. It fired a bolt through Rogowski's skull and then retracted. Pinhead, Rogowski said undeterred. The Cenobite made no reply. He simply hooked the trephine back on his belt and put his fingers into his own mouth, seeking out something that lodged within. Finding it, he drew the thing out, a small, slick, blackened hunk like a diseased tooth. He returned his fingers to the hole in Rogowski's skull, inserting the object and letting go of Rogowski's throat in the same moment. I'm guessing I'll be dead soon, right? To paraphrase Churchill, I'll be dead in the morning, but you'll still be Pinhead, Rogowski growled. The Cenobite had already turned his back on Rogowski. The hooks that held Hayadat in place had clearly waited for their master to turn back to them before they performed their coup de grace. Now, blessed with his gaze, they showed their skills. The hook, a weapon that the demon had affectionately named the fisherman's hook, was attached to a chain that had found purchase in the ceiling. It suddenly and swiftly tore through the roof of Hayadat's mouth, lifting his entire body clear of the ground. The moment the Cenobite's gaze landed upon the rusty, blood-caked links, eruption followed eruption. Hayat's hands split in two, the feet the same. The huge bulk of his thighs were gouged from groin to knees. His face was stripped of skin, and the three deeply embedded hooks in his chest and stomach pulled out heart, lungs, and entrails all at once. Surely a faster autopsy had never taken place. Their task complete, the hooks dragged what parts of him they'd claimed through the pools of blood, back toward the place from whence they'd come. Only one remained, the fisherman's hook, from which the empty and significantly lighter carcass of Yashar Hayat hung slowly, swinging back and forth, the drooping doors of his stomach bright with fat, flapping open and closed. All the fireworks were red again tonight, the Cenobite said, as though bored of the whole affair. Felixson, still rutting like a dog, pulled himself out of Kotlov and retreated from the spreading blood. Seeking purchase, his hand landed on something soft. He turned, and his face fell. Lily was all he said. The demon turned his head to see what Felixson saw. It was Lily Sappho. The sight of Hayat's slaughter had apparently been too much for her. She was slumped dead against the far wall. There was a stricken expression on her face, and her hands still clutched at her chest. "Let's be done with this," the demon said, turning to face the three remaining magicians. "You, Felixson." The man's face was all snot and tears. "Me? You play the dog well. I have work for you. Wait for me in the passage." Felixson didn't need to be told twice. Wiping his nose, he followed the demon's instructions and fled to the exit. Though Felixson was going naked into hell on the heels of the creature who had slaughtered almost every friend he'd ever had, he was happy with his lot. So happy, in fact, that he scurried through the ragged door in the mausoleum wall to wait for his new master to come to him, and never once looked back. He went far enough down the passageway to be reasonably certain he would not hear the screams of his friends, and then he squatted against the crumbling wall and wept. "What's wrong with me?" Rogowski said. "You're infected with a tiny sibling of mine, Joseph. A worm made from a piece of me. I passed it from its crib beside my cheek into a hole in your skull. Its body is filled with tiny eggs that need only the presence of warm, soft nourishment to be born." Rogowski was not a stupid man. He understood completely the significance of what he'd just been told. It explained the unwelcome fullness in his head, the churning motion behind his eyes, the tang of bitter fluid draining from his nose and down the back of his throat. Rogowski hawked up a wad of phlegm and spat at the Cenobite, who deflected it with a tiny motion of his hand. When it hit the floor, Rogowski saw the truth of the matter. It wasn't phlegm he'd brought up. It was a little knot of worms. "You're an asshole," Rogowski said. "You have the rarest of opportunities to die twice, and you waste your breath with banal insults? I'd hoped for more from you, Joseph." Rogowski coughed, and in the midst of the hacking lost his breath. He tried to recover it, but his throat was blocked. He dropped to his knees, and the impact was sufficient to burst the fragile panel of his skin so that veins of worms fell from his anatomy, littering the ground around him. Mustering the last of his will, he lifted his head to defy his destroyer with his stare, but before he could do so, his eyes dropped back into their sockets, his nose and mouth following quickly after. In seconds, his face had gone entirely, leaving only a bowl of bone brimming with the Cenobite's writhing descendants. There was a shrill shriek behind Rogowski, and finally finished with him, the demon turned toward the den, only to find that in his preoccupation with Rogowski's demolition, he had missed the only pregnancy Kotlov would ever take to full term. The shriek had not come from her, however. She was dead, slumped on her back and torn in two, killed by the trauma of the infant's birth. The thing that the demon had created in her, however, lay in a puddle of its own fetid fluids, shrieking in the tone the demon had mistaken for its mother's voice. The creature was female, and, at a glance, virtually human. The demon surveyed the mausoleum. It was indeed a comprehensive spectacle. The pieces of potash sprawled at the door, Hayat's head and mutilated carcass still swaying slightly as it hung from the fisherman's hook. Lily Sappho, forever frozen, her body ravaged by time, her face a distressing testament to the empirical power of fear itself, her life claimed by the only thing to which every soul must answer, and finally, Rogowski, collapsed into little more than a mess of bone and worms. The worms, disrespectful guests that they were, had already begun to desert his remains in search of another feast. The first of the departees had found pieces of hideout in one direction and the half-mangled corpse of Elizabeth Kotlov in the other. The Cenobite knelt between Kotlov's bloody legs and selected a blade from his belt. Taking the purple clot of the child's birth cord in one hand, he severed it and tied it into a knot. He then found her mother's blouse, mercifully unstained, and and wrapped the child in it. Hey, Big Dazo, or Dazo. Wrapped her child in it. Even swaddled, she continued to make a noise like an angry bird. The demon regarded her with a curiosity entirely devoid of concern. "You're hungry." "He's hungry," the demon said. "DWSN, where's Wooly? What's up, you guys?" The Cenobite stood, holding on to one end of the silk swaddling, and released the child, letting her unroll high above her mother's corpse. The baby tumbled, then dug her claws deep into the blouse and clung there, looking into her caretaker's eyes, issuing a reptilian hiss as she did so. "Drink," he instructed. He shook the fabric to which his creation clung, and she fell upon her mother's corpse. Getting up onto all fours, the child made her erring way to Elizabeth's left breast, where she kneaded the cooling flesh with her hands, which had already spouted uncommonly long fingers for an infant so young. "What's up, dope?" Let's see. So young. And when Kotlov's milk began to once more flow from her lifeless bosom, the child suckled greedily. The demon then turned his back on the child and returned from whence he came. His loyal dog, Felixson, waiting in the wings. As the bricks and mortar moved back into their original positions, sealing themselves behind the departing demon, the child, still growing, was now easily twice as large as she had been at birth. It was a little after dawn when the Cenobite left the mausoleum, and by that time his progeny had already emptied both breasts and was tearing his mother's chest open for the meat inside. The crackling of the corpse's breastbone echoed loudly around the small, musty room. The Swan, why? We are reading a story called The Scarlet Gospels by Clive Barker. It's a horror story. So that should give you an idea of why I have that little rated R thing down here. The naked girl's anatomy was undergoing a violent growth, and every so often could be heard the sound of pain, muted because it came through gritted teeth. Utterly unaware of her father's desertion, the young demon girl moved about the room like a pig at a trough, gluttonously devouring the remains of the once powerful magicians, effectively erasing the last remnants of an order of magic that had moved behind the shadows of civilization for centuries. By the time the police arrived, alerted by the unwitting soul who discovered the hideous spectacle that was the mausoleum, a frail and broken groundskeeper who vowed he would never again set foot in a cemetery, the girl, fully a woman after less than 12 hours, was gone. Ooh. Child of Pinhead, or child of the Hell Priest. And another scene comes up. 2 decades ago, Harry D'Amour, I think this is the detective or something. Harry D'Amour had turned 23 in New Orleans, drunk as a lord on Bourbon Street. Now here he was in the same city that had taken terrible wounds from hurricanes and human greed, but had somehow survived them all, its taste of celebration unscathed. Harry was drinking in the same bar on the same street 24 years later. And there was music being played by a jazz quintet led, believe it or not, by the same trumpet player and vocalist, one Mississippi Moses. And there were still one-night love affairs happening on the little dance floor, just as there had been almost a quarter of a century before. Harry had danced then with a beautiful girl who claimed to be Mississippi's daughter. While she and Harry danced, she told him that if they wanted to do something bad tonight, Harry remembered perfectly the way she'd smiled, and she said bad. Then she had a place where they could play. They'd gone up to a little room above the bar where her papa's music could be heard loud and clear, coming up from below. That little fact should have warned Harry that this was a family affair, and that men who have daughters can also have sons. But all of his blood had gone south once he had his hand up her dress, and just about the time he had slid a finger into the moist heat of her, the door opened and the girl made a pantomime of being surprised to see her 2 brothers, who were now standing in the room looking almost convincingly upset. The two intruders into Harry's bliss had played out a scene they probably performed half a dozen times nightly, informing him that their lovely sister was a virgin and that there wasn't a man in the bar who would ever testify to having seen him if they dragged his Yankee carcass to a tree hidden behind a wall just a minute's walk from there, where a noose was already hanging, waiting for a taker. But they assured him that they were reasonable men, and if Demore had enough money on him, they could maybe overlook his transgressions. Just this once, of course. Naturally, Harry had paid up. He'd emptied his wallet and his pockets and almost lost his best Sunday shoes to the taller of the two brothers, except that they had been too big for him. The brothers knocked Harry around a little as he made his exit, tossing his shoes back at him and leaving the door open so he could make his escape, the lighter for a few $100, but otherwise unharmed. Let's see. Turn to the side, Swan? Okay, well, I can do that a little bit, I guess. All these years later, Harry had come to the bar half hoping to find the girl still there. Changed, of course, by the passing of so many years, but still recognizable. She wasn't there, and neither were her ostensible brothers, just the old jazz musician, eyes closed as he played, riffing on the bittersweet love songs that had been old when Harry had first heard Mississippi Moses play them all those years ago. None of this nostalgia, however, did much to improve Harry's state of mind, nor did his reflection, which he caught in the age-eaten mirror behind the bar whenever he looked up. No matter how much liquor he downed, it refused to blur, and Harry saw all too clearly the scars of battle and time. Harry noted his own gaze, which, even when hurried, had taken on a distrustful cast. There was a downward tug at the corners of his mouth, the consequence of too many unwelcome messages delivered by unlovely messengers. Notes from the dead, subpoenas from infernal courts, and the steady flow of invoices for the services of the janitor in Queens, who would burn anything in his furnace for a price. Harry Demore had never wanted a life like this. He'd attempted to make a normal life for himself, a life untainted by the secret terrors whose presences he had first encountered as a child. The keeping of the law, he had reasoned, would be as good a bastion as any against the forces that stalked his soul. And so, lacking the smarts and the verbal dexterity required of a good lawyer, he became instead a member of New York's finest. At first the trick seemed to work, driving around the streets of New York, dealing with problems that reared from the banal to the brutal, and back again twice in the same hour. He found it relatively easy to put to the back of his mind the unnatural images that stood beyond the reach of any gun or law that had been made. That wasn't to say that he didn't recognize the signs when he sensed them. However, a gust of wind carrying the scent of corruption was enough to call up black tide from the base of his skull, which he only managed to drive back by sheer force of will. But the labor of normality took its toll. There wasn't a single day in his time as a cop in which he hadn't needed to cook up a quick lie or two to keep his partner, an occasional affable family man known affectionately as Sam Scummy Schomburg, from knowing the truth. After all, Harry wouldn't wish the truth upon anyone, but the road to hell is paved with the bubbling mortar of good intentions, and ultimately Harry's lies and half-truths weren't enough to save his partner. Scummy Schomburg's nickname, however lovingly used, was well earned. Besotted as he was by his 5 children, the last 4 were accidents, his mind was never far from the gutter, which, on nights when he was on duty and the mood struck him, ensured that he'd be spending time driving up and down the squalid streets where hookers plied their trade, until he'd found a girl who looked healthy enough, Lord knows I can't take some fucking disease home, for him to arrest and then subsequently set free once he'd received some complimentary service in a nearby alley or doorway. "Another Jack?" the bartender asked Harry, shaking Harry from his reverie. "No," Harry replied. A memory of Scummy's libidinous leer had come into Harry's head, and from there his mind ran in quick autonomous leaps to the last moments of his partner's life. "Don't need that." Harry spoke more to himself than the bartender as he rose from his bar stool. "Sorry?" The bartender said. "Nothing," Harry replied, sliding the $10 bill he'd left toward the man as though he were paying him not to ask any more questions. Harry needed to get out of here and put his memories behind him, but despite his alcoholic haze, his mind was still faster than his feet, and his protests notwithstanding, it brought him back to that terrible night in New York, and he instantly found himself sitting in the patrol car down on 11th Street, waiting for Scummy to get his rocks off. Scummy and his chosen receptacle were out of sight, down some steps leading to the basement of a building. The place was empty, its doors and windows bricked or boarded up more thoroughly than Harry ever remembered seeing before. He glanced at his watch. It was 10 after 2 in the morning, in the middle of June. Harry was getting a little antsy, and he knew why. His body always knew before his brain that something bad was in the vicinity. Harry tapped impatiently on the wheel, scanning the deserted street for some clue to the whereabouts of whatever was inspiring the irritation in his system. As a kid, he called it his UI, or UE, which stood for unscratchable itch. I guess it's UI. Adulthood hadn't offered him any reason to change the name, so the UI was still in the private vocabulary he'd created to help him put some order into the mental chaos its presence had always produced. Was there something under the flickering lamp on the other side of the street? If it existed, it did so at the very limit of his eye's power to separate substance from shadow. The possible thing seemed to Harry to move with a feral feline grace. No, he'd had it wrong. There was nothing. But even as he formed the thought, the possible thing confirmed his initial suspicion by turning back and retreating into the shadows, its muscular form shifting like breeze-quickened water as the shadows erased it. The thing's departure, however, failed to ease the eye in Harry's UI. It hadn't been the cause of his prickling skin. No, that was still nearby. He opened the door of the patrol car and got out, moving slowly so as not to attract attention. Then he studied the street from end to end. A block and a half up 11th he saw, tethered to a fire hydrant, a goat. It looked both pitiful and unlikely there on the sidewalk. The peculiarities of its anatomy, distended flanks, bulging eyes, bony skull, positively alien. Harry got out of the undercover patrol car, leaving his door open, and started to walk toward his partner, his hand staying instinctively to the handle of his gun as he did so. Harry was 3 strides across the street when he felt the UI come over him like a tidal wave. He stopped, glancing at the short stretch of empty sidewalk that lay between him and the darkened stairway, where Scummy had gone with the girl. What was taking so damn long? Harry took 2 tentative steps, calling to his partner as he did so. "All right, Scummy, zip it up. Time to move." "What?" Scummy shouted. "Oh, God, that's good. You sure you don't want in on this, partner? This bitch'll—" "I said it's time, Sam." "Uno momento, Harry. Just one. God damn. Oh yeah, just like that. Scummy likes that. Freaking perv. Scummy's a perv." Harry's gaze went back to the goat. The front door to the building outside which the animal was tethered had opened. Blue lights burned within, like candle flames, fluttering at a midnight mass. Harry's itch rose beyond the unbearable. Slowly but with purpose, he crossed the cracked sidewalk to the top of the stairs and glanced down into the murk, where he could vaguely make sense of Scummy lounging against the wall, his head back while the hooker worked on her knees in front of him. Judging by the sloppy, desperate sounds of the job she was doing, she wanted the cop to shoot his load already so she could spit it out and go. "God damn it, Sam," Harry said. "Christ, Harry, I hear you. You've had your fun. I ain't come yet. How about we find another girl on another street?" As he spoke, Harry glanced back at the goat, then at the open door. The blue candle flames had ventured out into the street, detached from wick and wax. They were lighting the way for something. Harry's gut told him he didn't want to be around when that something finally showed itself. "Oh, you're good," Scummy said to the whore. "I mean really good. Better than my fucking brother-in-law," he chuckled to himself. "That's it," Harry said, and he went down the remaining stairs, losing sight of both the light-attended doorway and the goat as he caught hold of Scummy's jacket shoulder. Harry pulled his partner away, the girl dropping forward onto her hands as Demore dragged Scummy up the stairs. "What's going on?" she demanded. "Does this mean you're booking me?" "Shut up," Harry said in a hushed tone. "You're not getting booked, but if I ever see you on this block again—" There was a wretched shrieking from the goat at that moment, which lasted a full 3 seconds as it echoed in the prematurely still night air. Then the sound abruptly ended, leaving them once more in silence. Fuck, Harry said. "What was that?" Scummy said. "Goat." "What? I didn't see no goat." "Scummy?" "Yeah?" "On 3, we're going to make a run for the car, okay?" Okay, but..." Harry cut in, speaking with a hushed urgency. "There is no but, Scummy. You look at the car, and you keep looking at the car until you're in and we're away. Anything else and we're dead men." "Harry, what?" "Trust me now, come on." "Ah, Christ, my zipper's stuck." "Forget your fucking zipper. Nobody's going to be looking at your dick. I promise you that. Now move." Scummy ran. Harry, following fast behind, looked down the street as he made his way silently to the car. The goat's throat had been open, but it was far from dead. Its robed slaughterer stood there, holding the thrashing animal by the legs, its head pulled back to make the partial throat cut gape and speed the flow of blood. Poor goats, man. They always get fucked over. The goat's life force came out of it in spurts, like water from a faulty faucet. The goat and butcher were not the only presences in attendance, however. There was a third member of the party, his back to Harry. As Harry crossed the street toward the car, the third member turned to look back. Harry caught a glimpse of his face, a mangled smear of formless flesh like a hunk of discarded clay, before the man plunged his hands into the goat's spurting blood. Scummy had made it halfway to the car, then, contrary to Harry's instruction, looked at the unsightly tableau. It had stopped Scummy in his tracks. Harry transferred his gun from right hand to left and used the right to grab hold of Scummy's arm. "Come on! See that? Let it go, Scummy. That ain't right, Harry. Neither's getting a blowjob from a teenage runaway." "That's different. People can be slaughtering fucking goats in the street. It's fucking disgusting." Scummy took out his gun. "Hey, you two degenerates with the goat. Do not fucking move. You're both under arrest." So saying, he started to walk toward them. Harry cursed under his breath and followed. Somewhere nearby, no more than 2 or 3 blocks over, the whooping of an ambulance siren reminded Harry that somehow the rational world was still a stone's throw away from this wretched scene. But Harry knew it didn't matter. These types of things, all pieces of one unknowable mystery, threw up veils around themselves that made seeing them clearly a difficult thing for ordinary eyes. If Scummy had been alone, he would have likely have driven past this grotesquerie without even registering its existence. It was only because Harry was with Scummy that he saw, and the knowledge of that was like a stone in Harry's guts. "Hey, assholes!" Scummy hollered, his shouts echoing back and forth between the facades of the deserted buildings. "Stop that shit!" The 2 men did the worst possible thing in response. They obeyed. Harry sighed as the butcher let the goat drop to the ground, its black legs still twitching, and the clay-faced man who'd been washing his hands in the blood raised himself from his stoop and turned to face the 2 policemen. "Oh, Christ alive," Scummy murmured. Harry saw the reason for Scummy's blasphemy. What had been an undefined gob of flesh 2 minutes ago was now organizing itself. The clay-like matter that Harry had first seen had now shifted. There was almost a nose, almost a mouth, and 2 holes like thumbprints where the eyes should have been. The clay man started toward them, steam rising from his blood-soaked hands. Scummy stopped advancing and threw the briefest of looks at Harry, just long enough to catch Harry's tiny nod back toward the car. In that time, the clay man's protean features had finally settled on a mouth, which he now opened, and a low noise escaped him, like the warning growl of an angered animal. "Watch out," Harry said, and the thing went from a walk to a run in 2 strides. "Go, go!" Harry shouted, and leveling his gun, shot at the thing once, twice, and then seeing the bullet slow the creature's run to a stagger, his blood blossoming on its shirt where he had been hit, Harry fired 3 more rounds, 2 to the torso and 1 to the head. The creature stood a moment in the middle of the street, looking down at his bloody shirt, his head slightly tilted as though in mild puzzlement. Behind him, Harry heard Scummy getting into the car and slamming the door. He gunned the engine, the wheels squealing as the car U-turned and pulled up to Harry. "Get in!" Scummy yelled. The creature was still examining his wounds. Harry had a moment's grace, and he took it. Turning his back on the beast, Harry scrambled over the hood of the car, threw open the door, and flung himself into the passenger seat. Before he'd even closed the door, Scummy accelerated. Harry caught a glimpse of the creature as they raced past him and saw, as if Harry were perfectly still and able to take in every detail of the moment, the creature's heavy head rise, showing 2 tiny dots of light burning in his thumbhole eyes. The beast was pronouncing a death sentence with his stare. "You gotta be fucking kidding," Harry said. "That bad, huh?" "Worse." They were already almost a block past the creature, and for a few deceitful moments Harry thought perhaps he'd misread the look in the enemy's gaze, and they might actually be able to reach the safety of a busy street unharmed. But then Harry's itch returned, just in time for his partner to shout, "Jesus, fuck!" Harry looked back to see that the enemy was giving chase, and he was closing in on the speeding vehicle with every stride. The beast had raised his steaming, blood-stained hands in front of his body, palms out, fingers spread freakishly wide. As he ran, his hands became brighter, like the dull embers of a fire woken by a sudden wind. Sparks were flying off his hands now, yellow-white, turning to smoke, darkening as they did so. Harry turned on the siren and emergency lights in the hopes that the creature was of a rare breed that could be felled by such tactics. but far from dissuading the enemy from his pursuit. The alarm seemed to intend to lend speed to his heels. Fuck, it's almost on us, Harry. Yeah. How many bullets did you put in that fucking thing? 5? Fuck. Just keep driving. Fuck. You know any prayers, Scummy? Not one. Fuck. And then the beast was on them, slamming his burning hands down on the rear of the car with such strength that the front end kicked into the air. For a few seconds, the wheels were off the ground, and by the time they hit the street again, the enemy was smashing through the back windows. The stink of frying goat's blood filled the car. Out! Harry yelled. Scummy threw open his door. The car was still moving, but Scummy was out anyway. Harry felt the heat of the enemy's hands behind his head and smelled the hairs on his neck burn up. He had his door open, only an inch, but it was open. Then he grabbed the dashboard with his left hand to put some force behind his exit and threw himself against the door. Clean, cool air met him for a second, then so did the street. He tried to roll into the fall, failed and landed on his head, rubbing the side of his face skinless on the cracked asphalt, until he finally came to a halt. The adrenaline in his veins forgave his body its frailties, at least for a few seconds. He got up, wiping dirt and blood from his eyes, and looked for Scummy. Scummy was standing 10 yards from Harry, half hidden by the black smoke of the burning car. He had his gun pointed directly at Harry. Scummy, what? Behind you! Harry turned. The beast stood in the smoke-laced air, no more than 2 yards from where Harry was standing. His human garments had been largely burned away by the blaze he had started, and it gave Harry an unwelcome view of just how pleasurable the beast was finding all this madness. His penis was standing up in bliss, its mottled head unsheathed. The hair around his base was burning so that the member seemed to rise from a thicket of flame, and if the rock-hard salute wasn't proof enough of the beast's contented condition, the smile on his face was. He raised his right hand. The flames were now out, leaving the hand black and smoking, but otherwise undamaged. The only places where the memory of fire remained were in the lines of the monster's palms, which were still bright with heat, the embers glowing brightest at the dead center of his hands. Harry wanted to pull his eyes away from the spot, but they wouldn't come unglued, at least not until he'd watched the place in the center of the beast's hand burn brighter still and finally issue a fleck of white fire that flew past Harry's head, missing him by inches. He had time, in his stupefied state, to be thankful that the beast had missed his mark. Then Harry realized that of course the fiery fleck wasn't meant for him. He turned, yelling to Scummy, but both the motion and the warning were slow, too slow, as though the air around him had the consistency of tar. Harry watched Scummy, standing a dozen yards away, watching with the same tar-trapped eyes, powerless to do anything as the fleck of white fire approached and struck him in the throat. Scummy slowly raised his free hand to brush it off, but before his hand could reach it, the fleck burst and 2 bright lines of fire raced around his neck, one going left and the other right, circling fully around and meeting again at his Adam's apple. For a moment, the air around Scummy's head flared up, shivering and shimmering like a wave of heat over scorched earth. But before Scummy could utter a word, a sheath of flames sprang up and swallowed his face. His head was on fire, from his Adam's apple to the bald spot he'd forever been combing his hair over. That's when Scummy began screaming. Terrible, guttural cries like silverware being run through the garbage disposal. Time continued to unravel at the same indolent rhythm, obliging Harry to watch the heat at work on his partner's flesh. Scummy's skin grew redder and redder at the blaze, shining beads of fat appearing from the pores and bursting as they ran over his face. Harry started to raise his hands to remove his jacket, his mind just clear enough to imagine he might still smother the flames before they did any real harm. But as Harry made to move, the beast grabbed Harry's shoulder, spinning him around, and pulled him close. Now facing the wretched creature, Harry watched as the creature held his smoldering hand out and cupped it just below Harry's chin. "Spit," the creature said, his voice matching his misshapen appearance. Harry did nothing by way of reply. "Saliva or blood?" the beast warned. "That's easy," Harry continued. Harry didn't know why this thing needed anything from him, nor did he particularly like the idea of the creature owning a piece of him, but the proposed alternative was clearly worse. He did his best to summon a wad of spittle, but the offering he dropped into the beast's hands was meager. The adrenaline had left Harry's mouth as dry as a set of sun-bleached bones. "More," the beast said. Harry went deep this time and brought up the good ripe stuff from every pocket of his throat and mouth, gathered it, rolled it, and spat it with gusto into the beast's palm. It was a nice piece of work, no question. To judge by the crude, lipless smile on his face, the beast was well pleased. "Watch," he said. Then he wrapped his hand, into which Harry had spat, around his erection. "Watch?" Harry said, glancing down in disgust. "No," the creature said. "Him. You and me. We watch him." As the beast spoke, he began to work his rod with long, leisurely strokes. His free hand still rested on Harry's shoulder, and with overpowering force, he turned Harry back toward his partner. Harry was appalled to see that the damage done in the few seconds of Harry's gaze had been averted and already rendered Scummy unrecognizable. His hair had burned away entirely, and his naked head was a bubbling ball of red and black. His eyes were virtually closed by the heat-swollen flesh, and his mouth hung open, burning tongue sticking out like an accusing finger. Harry tried to move, but the hand on his shoulder kept him from the job. He tried to close his eyes against the horror, but the creature, though he was standing behind Harry, somehow knew that he was disobeying his instruction. The beast pushed his thumb into the clenched muscle of Harry's shoulder, penetrating it with the ease of a man pressing his thumb into an overripe pear. "Open!" the beast demanded. Harry did as he was told. The blistered meat of Scummy's face had started to blacken, the swollen skin cracking open and curling back from the muscle. "God forgive me, Scummy. God fucking forgive me." "Oh," the beast gasped, "you dirty-mouthed whore." Without warning, the beast unloaded. Then he gave a shuddering sigh and turned Harry to face him once more. The two lighted pinpoints of his eyes seeming to burrow into Harry's head and scratched at the back of his skull. "Stay out of the triangle," he said. "Understand?" "Yes." "Say it." "I understand." "Not that. The other thing. Say it, like you did before." Harry gritted his teeth. There was a definitive point where his flight was overridden by his fight, and he was fast approaching it. "Say it," the beast said. "God forgive me," he said through gritted teeth. "No, I want to have it in my head for later. Give me something good to work with." Harry mustered the voice of entreaty as best as he could, which, as it turned out, wasn't very hard. "God, forgive me." Harry woke around noon, the sound of his partner screaming, nearer than his liquor-soaked memories of the previous night's birthday celebrations. The streets outside his room were gratifyingly quiet. All he heard was a bell, calling those who were still faithful to a Sunday Mass. He ordered up some coffee and juice, which came while he was showering. The day was already humid, and by the time he dried himself, he'd already started work on a fresh sweat. As he sipped his coffee, strong and sweet, he watched the people toing and froing in the streets 2 stories below. The only pair in any hurry were a couple of tourists with a map. Everyone else was going about their business at a nice mellow speed, pacing themselves for the long hot day and the long hot night that would surely follow. The phone rang. Harry picked it up. "Are you checking up on me, Norma?" he said, trying his best to sound human. "Got it in one, detective," Norma said. "And no, it wouldn't do me much good, would it? You're too good a liar, Harry Dimore." "You did teach me everything I know. Watch it now. How was the birthday celebration?" "I got drunk. No surprises there. And I started thinking about the past. Oh, Lord, Harry, what have I told you about leaving that shit alone?" "I don't invite the thoughts in." Norma spat out a humorless laugh. "Honey, we both know you were born with an invitation stamped on your forehead." Harry grimaced. "And all I can say is what's already been said," Norma continued. "What's done is done, the good and the bad both. So make peace with it, or it'll swallow you whole." "Norma, I want to do what I came here to do and get out of this goddamn city." "Harry..." But he had already gone. Norma pursed her lips and hung up the phone. She knew what to expect from Harry Dimore, but that didn't mean she was inured to his brooding, tortured facade. Yes, otherness had a way of finding Harry wherever he went, but there were things that could be done about that. Measures that could be taken if one was so inclined. Harry Dimore never took those measures because Norma knew Harry Dimore loved his job. More importantly, he was damn good at it, and as long as that was the case, Norma would forgive him his transgressions. Norma Payne, black, blind, and admitting to being 63, though the truth was probably closer to 80 or more, sat in her favorite chair by the window of her 15th floor apartment. It was from this spot that she had spent 12 hours of every day for the last 40 years talking to the dead. It was a service she had offered to the recently deceased, who were, in Norma's experience, often lost, confused, and frightened. She'd seen the departed in her mind's eye since infancy. Norma had been born blind, and it had come as quite a shock to her when she first realized that the benign faces she could remember looking down at her in her cot were not those of her parents, but those of the curious departed. The way she saw it, she was lucky. She wasn't really blind, she just saw a different world from most other folks, and that put her in a unique position to do some good in the world. Somehow, if someone was dead and lost in New York, sooner or later they found their way to Norma. Some nights there were phantoms lined up half a block or more, sometimes just a dozen or so, and occasionally she would be so inundated with needy phantoms that she would have to turn all 103 televisions in her apartment on, all playing relatively low but tuned to different channels in a new babble of game shows, soap operas, weather reports, scandal, tragedy, and banality, in order to drive them all away. It wasn't often that Norma's counseling of the recently dead overlapped with Harry's life as a private investigator, but there were always exceptions. Karsten Good had been one such case. Good by name, good by nature. That was how he styled his life. Good was a family man who had married his high school sweetheart. Together they lived in New York with 5 kids to raise and more than enough money to do so, thanks to fees he charged as a lawyer, a few good investments, and a deep-seated faith in the generosity of the Lord his God, who took, as Karsten was fond of saying, best care of those who cared best about him. At least that had been his belief until 8 days ago, when within the space of 100 seconds his well-ordered, God-loving life had gone to hell. Karsten Good had been on his way to work bright and early, eager as a man half his age to be in the thick of things, when a youth had darted toward him through the throng of early birds on Lexington Avenue and snatched Karsten's briefcase right out of his hand. Lesser men would have yelled for help, but Karsten Good was more confident in the state of his body than most his age. He didn't smoke or drink. He worked out 4 times a week and only sparingly indulged in his passion for red meat. None of these things, however, stopped him from being felled by a massive heart attack just as he came within 2 or 3 strides of the felon he decided to chase down. Good was dead, and death was bad. Not simply because he'd left his beloved Patricia alone to raise their children, or he wouldn't now get to write the book of his personal revelations about life and the law that he'd been resolving to do every New Year's Eve for the past decade. No. The truly bad thing about Good being dead was the little house in the French Quarter of New Orleans that Patricia didn't know he owned. He had been especially careful to keep all knowledge of its existence a secret. But he had not factored into his arrangements the possibility that he'd drop dead in the street without the least warning. Now he was faced with the inevitable dissolution of everything that he'd worked so hard to appear to be. Sooner or later, somebody, either Patricia, going through the drawers in his desk, or one of his associates dutifully tidying up the work Good had left unfinished in the firm, would turn up some reference to number 68 DuPont Street in Louisiana, and tracking down the owner of the house at this address, would discover it had been Karsten. And it was only a matter of time before they would go down to New Orleans to find out what secrets it would reveal. And the secrets were abundant. Well, Karsten Good wasn't about to take this lying down. Once he adjusted to his less corporeal state, he next learned the way the system worked on the other side, and, putting his skills as a lawyer to work, he very soon had jumped to the front of a long line and found himself in the presence of the woman he had been assured would solve his problems. "You're Norma Payne?" he said. "That's right. Why do you have so many televisions? You're blind." "And you're rude. I swear the bigger the bully, the smaller the dick." Carson's jaw dropped. "You can see me?" "Unfortunately, yes." Karsten looked down at his body. He, like every ghost he'd met since his death, was naked. His hands instantly moved to his withered penis. "There's no need to be offensive," he said. "Now, please, I have money, so..." Norma got up from her chair and walked straight at Good, murmuring to herself. "Every night I get one of these dead-ass fools thinking they can buy their way into heaven. There's a trick my mama taught me," she said to Good. "Once she knew I had the gift. It's called ghost pushing." With the palm of her left hand, she shoved Good in the middle of the chest. He stumbled backwards. "How did you..." "2 more of those and you're gone. Please, listen to me." She shoved again. "Make that 1. Say goodnight. I need to talk to Harry D'Amour." Norma stopped dead in her tracks and said, "You've got 1 minute to change my mind about you." "Harry D'Amour, he's a private investigator, right? I was told you know him." "What if I do? I have urgent need of his services. And like I said, money is no consequence. I'd prefer to talk directly to D'Amour after he's signed A confidentiality agreement, of course. Norma laughed, hard and long. I never cease, she started to reply, her words having to compete with her unfettered amusement. Carcassius, thanks for the follow. Meets me, 72, thanks for the follow, you guys are awesome. I never cease, she started to reply, her words having to compete with her unfettered amusement. Never cease to be amazed at how many absurdities can be uttered in perfect seriousness by folks like you. In case you haven't noticed, you're not in your law offices now. Ain't no use in hanging on to your little secrets. Seeking old, thanks for the follow. 'Cause you got nowhere to put them except up your ass. So talk, or I'm gonna leave you to find some other ghost talker. Okay. Just don't send me away. The truth, I own a house in New Orleans. Nothing fancy, but I use it as a place to get away from my responsibilities as a family man. Oh, I've heard this story before. And what is it you do in this little house of yours? Entertain. I bet you do. And who are the entertained? Men, young men, legal age, mind you, but young nonetheless. And it's not what you think. No drugs, no violence. When we meet, we make magic. He spoke the word quietly as though he might be overheard. It's never serious, just some bits of nonsense I got out of old books. I find it keeps things spicy. I still haven't heard a compelling reason to help you. So you had yourself a secret life. Then you up and died, and now people are going to find out. That's the bed you made. Make your peace with what you were and move on. No, you misunderstand. I'm not ashamed. Yes, I fought what I was at first, but I came to terms with that a long time ago. That's when I bought the house. I don't give a shit what people think or the legacy I left behind. I'm dead. What does it matter now? It's the first sensible thing you've said all night. Yeah, well, there's no use denying it. And like I said, that's not the problem. I loved every moment I spent at that house. The problem is that I loved my wife, too. I still do. So much that I can't bear the thought of her ever finding out. Not for me, but because I know it would destroy her. That's why I need your help. I don't want my best friend to die knowing she didn't really know me. I don't want our kids to suffer the fallout of her wounds and my indiscretions. I need to know that they're going to be okay. There's enough in that story to make me think you might be a decent human being under all those layers of lawyer and liar. Good didn't raise his head. Does that mean you'll help me? I'll talk to him. When? Lord, but you're impatient. Look, I'm sorry, but every hour that passes makes it more likely that Patricia, that's my wife, is going to find something. And when she does, that's when the questions start. You've been dead how long? 8 days. Well, if your adoring wife loves you as much as you claim, I think it's reasonable to assume that she's far too busy grieving to be going through your papers. Grieving, Good said, as though the idea of his wife's anguish concerning his death had not really come into focus until now. Yes, grieving. I take that to mean you haven't been home to see for yourself? The lawyer shook his head. Couldn't. I was afraid. No, I am afraid of what I'll find. Like I said, I'll see what I can do. But I'm making no promises. Harry's a busy man and weary, though he won't admit to it. So be warned. I care about his welfare, as if he were my own flesh and blood. If this business in New Orleans goes sour because of something you fail to tell me here and now, I'll have an undead lynch mob chase down your lily-white ass and hang you up from a lamppost in Times Square until Judgment Day, understand? Yes, Miss Payne. Norma's fine, Karsten. How did you... Oh, come on now, I can see your dead naked ass, and you don't know how I know your name? Right. Right, so here's what we'll do. Come back tomorrow, early in the evening. I'm less busy then, and I'll see if I can persuade Harry to join us. Norma? Karsten mumbled. Yes? Thank you. Don't thank me yet. When you hire Demore, things have a tendency to become complicated. The subsequent meeting had gone smoothly enough, the dead Mr. Good giving Harry the number of a security box filled with cash, for those little expenses I didn't want my accountant asking me about, from which Harry could take as much as he felt appropriate for fees, flight, and hotel costs, with enough left to cover whatever problems might pop up that would need monetary lubrication to ease them away. All of this brought Demore to where he now stood, before Karsten's good house of sin. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, just a wrought iron door and a 12-foot wall with the number painted on a blue and white ceramic tile and set in the plaster beside it. Karsten had been able to supply Harry with a detailed description of the kinds of incriminating toys Harry would find in the house, but he hadn't been in any condition to supply keys. Harry had told him not to worry. Harry had never met a lock he couldn't open. And true to form, he had the gate open in under 10 seconds and was walking up the uneven paved path that was bordered on either side by pots of various shapes and sizes, the mingled fragrances of blossoms as intense as a dozen shattered perfume bottles. Nobody had been there to take care of Good's garden in a long time, Harry noticed. The ground was slimy with decayed petals, and many of the species in the pots had perished for want of attention. Harry was surprised at the state of the place. A man as organized as Good would surely have made arrangements to keep his garden looking nice and neat, even when he wasn't there to view it. So what happened to the gardener? 4 strides farther, Harry reached the front door, and he had his answer. There were 30 or more fetishes nailed upon the door, some small, clear bottles containing scraps of God knew what, and one small clay representation of a man, his cock and balls no longer between his legs, but tied with glue-cake string around his face. The genitals were upside down, so that his testicles could be painted as eyes and his penis as a jutting nose that was daubed bright red. Not for the first time during this trip, Harry glanced around looking for some hint that his employer's spirit was somewhere nearby. Harry had been in the company of phantoms often enough to know what tiny signs to look for. A certain strangeness in the way shadows moved, sometimes a low-velocity hum, sometimes the simple silence of nearby animals. But Harry sensed nothing in the sunlit garden to suggest he had Good's company. It was a pity, really. It would have made the search and destroy mission ahead a damn sight more entertaining if Harry had known the owner of the House of Sin was witnessing everything. There was a thick line of what was undoubtedly dried blood poured across the house's threshold, its sacrificial thrashing source catching the lower half of the door in its death throes. Harry took out his pick again and quickly opened the 2 locks. "Knock, knock," he muttered as he turned the handle. The door creaked, but failed to move. He worked the handle back and forth a few times to be sure it was functioning, then put his shoulder to the job with all 197 pounds of him to back it up. Several of the bagged fetishes gave up the smell of their contents as he pressed against them, a dust of incense and dead flesh. Harry held his breath and forced the door. There was more creaking, then one loud crack that echoed against the courtyard walls, and he was in, stepping away from the fetishes before he took another breath. The air was cleaner on the inside than out, stale, yes, but nothing that instantly set off alarm bells. Harry paused for a moment. The phone in his pocket rang. He answered. "Impressive. Every case we've done together, you've been on the line as soon as I step into... Shit. No, Norma, the house. I've just stepped into the house. And you knew it. You always do. Lucky, I suppose," Norma said. "So is it a den of sodomy?" "Not at the moment, but the day is young." "Are you feeling better?" "Well, I ate several pastries and had 3 cups of the best damn coffee I ever drank, so I'm ready to go at it." "Then I'll leave you to it. Actually, I got a question for you. We got fetishes covering the front door, some jars with some kind of shit in them, a little clay man with disfigured genitals, and blood on the threshold." "And? Any idea what that's all about?" "Doing what fetishes do, somebody's trying to keep the wrong things out and the right things in. Do they look new?" "A week or so, judging by the blood." "So it wasn't Good's doing." "Definitely not. Besides, this is fairly elaborate stuff. Is it possible Good did serious magic down here?" "I doubt it. The way he talked, he was using the magic as a way of getting his guests naked. He might have bled a chicken or drew up some phony circle to give it some flavor, but I don't think it was anything more than that. Regardless, be careful. They do things differently down there. Voodoo's potent shit." "Yeah, and some of it's on my shoe." The conversation ended there. Harry pocketed his phone and began his search. Harry had only signed off with Norma for a minute, no more, when his exploration of the 3 small downstairs rooms brought him into contact with a patch of intensely cold air in the kitchen, which was a sure sign of a presence from the other side. He didn't attempt to retreat from it, or spit out the dozen verses he could recite that essentially meant, "Get thee the fuck out of my way." Instead, he stood perfectly still, the air so chilled his breath formed a dense cloud at his lips, while the cold patch circled him and circled again. Back in New York, when Harry finally left the force, he had sought a different type of protection. His queries soon brought him to one Kaz King, a tattoo artist known for his experience in arcane symbology. Kaz tattooed visual defenses against dark forces on the bodies of his clients. Upon his instruction, Kaz attempted to commit to Harry's body every alarm system in his arsenal that was applicable to all forms of non-human life that Harry might encounter. Kaz had done a thorough job, because the symbols and codes were soon fighting for space. Best of all, the alarm system actually worked. Even now, one of the small identification tattoos Kaz had drawn on Harry was twitching, telling him that his chilly, unseen visitor was something called a string yart, a harmless, nervous entity that resembled, in the words of those who'd studied them, a monkey made of loosely configured ectoplasm. Harry uttered the command, "No, go, yart." The first two words calling into life the complex design Kaz had spent a month of nights inking onto Harry's chest. The design was intended to be a universal repellent, and it worked beautifully. Harry felt the ink get a little hotter under his skin, and then suddenly the patch of cold air left his vicinity. He waited a few seconds to see if there were other curious presences here who also wanted to inspect him, but nobody came. After 2 or 3 minutes of looking around the kitchen and finding nothing even vaguely interesting, Harry went into the other 2 rooms on that floor. One had a dining table, polished but still much scratched. There were large metal fixtures beneath each corner of the table, placed there, he assumed, to make binding someone to the table easy. But that was all Harry found in either room that he'd need to deal with before leaving. Upstairs, however, was a different story. On the floor inside the first of the 3 bedrooms, there was a 4-foot-high bronze statue of a satyr in a state of extreme arousal. The lewd mischief of his intent wonderfully caught by the sculptor. Karsten, it soon became apparent, had quite an eye for erotic antiques. On one wall of the first bedroom was an arrangement of Chinese fans spread to display the elaborately choreographed orgies that decorated each one. And there was more antique erotica on the other walls. Prints that looked like illustrations to pornographic rewritings of the Old Testament, and a large fragment from a frieze, F-R-E-Z-E, if I'm saying that right, in which the orgiasts were interlocked in elaborate configurations. There was a double bed in the room, stripped back to a stained mattress and a dresser, which contained some casual clothes and a few letters, which Harry pocketed unread. Buried at the back of the middle drawer, Harry found another envelope, which contained one thing only, a photograph of what he took to be the Good family, standing beside a pool, frozen forever in a happier time. Finally, Harry had an image of Good, his grin unforced, his arm tightly clasping his happy spouse to his side. The kids, 3 girls, 2 boys, all seemed as guilelessly happy as their parents. It had been good to be Good that day, no question, and much as Harry scrutinized the father's face, he could see no sign that Good was a man with secrets. All the lines on his face were laugh lines, and his eyes gazed into the camera lens without a trace of reticence. Harry left the picture out on the top of the dresser for later visitors to find. Then he moved on to the next room. It was in darkness. Harry stayed at the threshold while he found a light switch. Nothing he'd seen in the house so far had prepared him for what came into view when the single naked bulb hanging at the center of the room went on. Here, finally, was something he could entertain Norma by describing. A leather sling hanging from the ceiling supported by heavy-duty rope. It was a black hammock designed for those special folks who rested best with their legs held high and wide. The windows in the room were sealed up with blackout fabric. Between the window and where Harry stood was a comprehensive collection of sex toys, dildos ranging in scale from the invasive to the inconceivable, whips, switches, and old-fashioned canes, 2 gas masks, coiled lengths of rope, plastic cylinders with rubber tubes attached, screw-down presses, and a dozen or so items that looked like esoteric surgical equipment. It was all meticulously clean. Even the faint pine odor of disinfectant was still present. But however bizarre and intense the ceremonies of pain and violation here had been, they had left nothing in the room that caused Kaz's tattoos to warn Harry of imminent trouble. The room was clean by both bacterial and metaphysical standards. "I see your point, Mr. Good," Harry murmured to the creator of this chamber of possibilities, absent though he was. Harry moved on to the next room, which he fully anticipated would contain proof of further escalation in Good's debaucheries. He opened the door, which was the only one inside the house that had sigils etched into it. Harry was unsure whether it was for keeping unwanted guests out or dangerous elements in, but he was certain he would soon find out. He flipped on the light, another bare bulb hanging on a ragged cord, to illuminate a room that, compared to the previous one, was a model of decorum. The windows were blacked out here too, and like the rest of the room, they were painted a light gray. Harry's tattoos gave off a warning twitch when he stepped over the threshold. He'd come to be able to interpret the subtle differences in the signals over the years. This warning was the equivalent of a blinking amber light. Some kind of magical working had been performed here, it told him. But where was the evidence? The room contained 2 plain wooden chairs, a bowl filled with what had been dog food, he guessed, its dried-up remains still attracting a few lazy flies. With its bare boards and its blacked-out windows, the room was certainly set up for magic. There were 2 oddities in the room's construction, which Harry had noticed the moment he surveyed the room. The right-hand window was placed too close to the corner of the room, which meant either that the architect had done a lousy job or that the room had been shortened at some point in its sordid history, with the far wall put up to create a very narrow and yet as yet unseen 4th space. Harry went over to the wall, looking for some way in. The multiplying of the signals from his tattoos indicated that he was indeed getting warmer in his ghostly game of Marco Polo. Harry looked down at the palm of his left hand, where Kaz had painfully drawn the searcher's sigil. For an instant, Harry was back on 11th Avenue, and the hand was not his, but that of the demon. Spit! Harry heard the word bounce off the walls in the claustrophobic space. Go fuck yourself, Harry said, and drove the vision from his head as he pressed his tattooed hand to the wall. Now he was on to something. A silent imperative, one that didn't slow its work by traveling by way of thoughts, took hold of Harry's hand and moved it over the wall, lower and lower until his little finger was brushing the ground. Harry felt the searcher's sigil's exhilaration at the hunt, quickening as his hand closed on its invisible quarry. There was a mark on the gray paint barely darker than the rest of the wall. And before Harry even realized it, his hand had already elected his middle finger to finish the job. It pressed lightly on the spot. There was an audible click, and then Harry was obliged to stand back as a door, exquisitely concealed by the gray paint, swung open on silent hinges. Mr. Karsten Good apparently had more to hide than his extensive collection of toys, and absurdly satisfied at the discovery, Harry stepped inside the small room to find out what. Like its predecessors, this tiny room had but a single bare bulb to illuminate it. But whereas there had been nothing in the previous rooms that was of any great interest to Harry, this narrow passage was another story entirely. One wall was given over to books, the scent of their antiquity powerful. It was a smell that Harry's 6 years as a pupil at St. Dominic's all-boys Catholic school had taught him to abhor. It brought back too many unwelcome memories of the casual brutalities of the place. There were the usual rulers across the knuckles and canes on bare buttocks, of course, but many of St. Dominic's staff had other appetites that a beating wouldn't placate. The fathers all had their favorites, but Harry had been spared the private lessons, as they were commonly called. He'd had more kick in him than any of the fathers were willing to handle. But as they say, hurt people, and the pupils themselves played their own version of the game. Harry had been their victim on several occasions, and the library was their location of choice. Father Edgar, the library's overlord, was often absent from his desk, dealing a harsh hand to boys who were lax about returning books. It was there, between the stacks, that the strong took the lesser, and it was there that Harry, his head pressed to the floor while he was used, learned to loathe the smell of old books. Waving away the scent and its unbidden memories, Harry scanned Good's secret library speedily, pausing only when he came upon titles of particular interest. Good's limited but nonetheless impressive library included the Carapace Derivations, a series of books that had undoubtedly driven more inept practitioners to self-slaughter than anything else on these well-stocked shelves. 2 thin volumes, their author unnamed, that seemed to be illustrated guides to suicide. A few books on sex magic, the K used, he guessed, as a nod to Crowley's explorations in this territory, and the Frey Kissant Dialogues, a grimoire that reputedly only existed in the edition of 1, which he was now holding in his hand, which was rumored to have been found in the ashes of the Yedlin, the child genius of Florence, who had been burned in one of Savonarola's purges. I think I'm saying that right. Harry's insatiable curiosity could not lessen the temptation to put its legend to the test. He raised the open book to his face and breathed deep. It smelled of fire. Harry suddenly saw Scummy's face, with his eyes spilling from their sockets as they burned, and he quickly closed the book. He'd seen more than enough of Good's collection, he decided. He turned his attentions from the shelf of books and looked to the other wall. There he found a few more rows of shelves. These were given over to the kind of stuff that Good had probably used to get his young, impressionable guests in the mood. Candles of red and black wax in the form of phalluses, a row of bottles intricately decorated with multicolored beads that were filled with, when Harry uncorked them, eye-stinging liquor, some of it vaguely smelling like brandy or whiskey, but clearly adulterated with good secret ingredients, whatever they were. Some were herbal, or herbal if you're from Britain. Harry's nose told him much else was not. God knows what prescription medications Good had ground up and dissolved in this sacred potion. Tranquilizers, most likely, and perhaps a few magic pills designed to cure erectile dysfunction. All this would have to go, of course, as would most of the other contents on these shelves. The phials of white powder, which he presumed was cocaine, the row of little fetish dolls with the faces of young men snipped from photographs and attached to the heads of the dolls with safety pins, along with a second set, this one of their genitals, similarly clipped and pinned but between their legs. Harry counted them. There were 26 dolls there in what he took to be Karsten Good's harem. Harry would have to take some advice from a local expert in these dolls before he committed them to the flames, just to make sure that it wouldn't cause all 26 young men they represented to ignite where they stood. Having explored the upper shelves, Harry now went down to his haunches, knees popping as he took a closer look at the middle rows. There were a number of large jars with vacuum-sealed lids used for homemade preserves. But the contents of these jars weren't as benign as blackberry jam and pickled onions. They contained dead things in a solution of what was probably formaldehyde. Some freakish, a two-headed rat, an albino toad, its eyes bright red. Some decidedly sexual, a human penis, a jar entirely filled with testicles, like pinkish eggs, a fetus with an endowment long enough to wrap around its own throat, and some that had simply rotted or disintegrated in the preserving fluid, leaving pieces of unrecognizable gristle in the murk. These, like the dolls, he would need the experience of some local expert to safely dispose of. Taken in their entirety, the items suggested that Good's interests in magic went a long way beyond the theatrics required to get a bunch of guests naked. Sure, a few of the freak show items might have been used as props to lend veracity to a faked ceremony, but that didn't explain the library or the row of dolls with their pinned-on portraits. He went down on his knees to search the shadowy recesses of the bottom shelves. There were more jars lined up there, but behind them, his blind hand came to rest on something very different. A small box, perhaps 4 inches square, which when he brought it out into the light proved to be an intricately carved on all 6 sides with golden etched designs. Now, my friends, we get our first glimpse, don't know if you'll be able to see this, of the Le Marchand's configuration, the Lament configuration. This is just a little necklace version of it. And it's golden. A prop very central to the entire Hellraiser series. Harry knew what it was the instant he had it in the light. It was a puzzle box. A piece more valuable and more dangerous than all the rest of Good's collection put together. Harry's fingers moved over the box without need of his instruction, eager to familiarize themselves with the feel of the thing. Don't tell me he's going to open it. He should know. I think he already knows what it is. The box released a host of stimuli through his inquiring fingers that made Harry feel good all the way down to his guts, and then having proffered this taste of bliss, suddenly withdrew it, leaving Harry feeling empty. He tried to duplicate the motions he'd made when he'd first picked the box up, but the bit of bliss was not to be had a second time. If he wanted more of the same, Harry knew from the stories, he would have to solve the puzzle that the box presented. Harry stood up and leaned on the bookshelves to take a better look at the glittering device. He'd never laid eyes on one until now. Named after their French designer, the devices were known simply as Le Marchand's boxes. In more knowing circles, however, they were also branded with a more truthful name, Lament Configurations. They existed in unknown numbers all around the world. Some, like this one, were in hiding, but many were out in the tide of human affairs and appetites, where they made terrible mischief. To solve the puzzle box was to open a door to hell, or so the story said. The fact that most of the people who solved the puzzles were innocents who'd chanced upon them was apparently a matter of indifference to hell and its infernal agents. A soul, it would seem, was a soul. Even though he knew all too well the danger a lament configuration presented, Harry could not quite persuade himself to put it back behind the specimen jars. Harry let the twitching pleasure in his fingertips slide over the box once more. That briefest of contacts the configuration had teased him with had been rapturous, and his fingers couldn't forget the feeling, and without even his instructing, his hands were investigating the box, as if reacquainting themselves with an old friend. Harry watched them, feeling oddly remote from their frenetic motion, and remoter still from the possibility of consequence. He could stop this at any moment, he told himself, but why stop so quickly when he could feel little trills of pleasure moving up through his fingers, to his hands, to his arms, to his whole weary system? He had plenty of time to call a halt to this before it got hazardous, famous last words. But in the meantime, why not enjoy the panacea that the box provided as it eased the aches in his joints and his back and sent a rush of blood to his groin? In this moment, the not-so-distant memory of Scummy, the humiliations at St. Dominic's, and the countless other ghosts of far too many pasts caused Harry no pain at all. They were all part of a pattern, like the sides of a Le Marchand's box. With time, it would all come to fit in some grand design, or so his untethered thoughts persuaded him. There was suddenly a subtle vibration from the box, and Harry struggled to focus more clearly on the nature of the power in his hand. If it was veiling itself from him, he knew, hiding its darker purpose behind the gifts of pleasure and reassurance. Put it down, he told himself, but his body had been unpleasured for so long, some Calvinistic streak in him denying anything that smacked of self-indulgence, as though it might weaken him when the battle began in earnest, as one day he knew it would, that this finger-marrow joy was enough to seduce him momentarily from the narrow road he had been so obsessively walking. In short, he did not put down the box, but continued to investigate it with something very close to tenderness. The puzzle was succumbing to him with an ease that inspired suspicion at the rim of his thoughts. It was showing its innards to him, their surfaces as intricately inscribed as the 6 external walls. His fingers could do no wrong now. They slid, they pressed, they stroked, and to each stimulus the box responded with its own flourish, sliding open to reveal an interior mazework of mechanisms that blossomed and seeded. Harry would have been lost to its beguilements had a sudden rush of purposeful Arctic air not enveloped him, turning the sweat of excitement on his back and brow to a suit of ice water. The spell was broken instantaneously, and his fingers, this time moved by his own instruction, dropped the open box at his feet. It made an uncanny sound in the narrow passage, as though something much larger had struck the ground. The string yard had returned. "Oh, for God's sake," Harry said. To Harry's astonishment, he got a reply. 2 of the small jars on the upper shelf flipped and fled to the floor, shattering. The phantom's presence had put such a chill on Harry that his teeth were chattering. "No. Go. Yart," Harry said, his voice laced with irritation. The cold air dissipated. No sooner had the yart heeded Harry's command than a banal tinkling tune rose from the ground, its source the lament configuration that lay gleaming among the scattered jars and their withered contents. "The hell?" said Harry. This was what good was attracting Harry's attention to. Though he'd let go of the box, the damn thing had made its solving its own responsibility. This was a new kink in the lore of the box for Harry. Whenever he'd found reference to the configuration, the victim had signed his own death warrant by solving the box's puzzle himself. "These things don't solve themselves, right?" Harry asked in the air. Several of the smaller bottles knocked against one another. "Now that reply I'm not so sure about," Harry said. The ghost passed behind the books, knocking every 3rd or 4th volume onto the floor. "Whatever you're trying to tell me," Harry stopped, unfinished, because his question was in the process of being answered. And the answer was yes, the box was indeed solving itself. Pieces of its internal anatomy slid into view and were lifting the box up. Hey there, real Kiwis. The parts coming into view were asymmetrical, causing the box to topple sideways. Now it had room to instigate the next stage in its self-solving, a 3-way separation of its top surface, which caused the unleashing of a discernible ripple of energy that carried the subtle but distinct odor of curdled milk. The box's maneuvers gathered speed, and staring down at it, watching the device perform, Harry decided it was time for this game to end. He raised his foot and brought it down on the box, intending to break it. He failed. Yes, indeed, the real Kiwis. Not because his weight wasn't sufficient to do the job, but because the box had a defense mechanism for which he had not accounted, somehow forcing his foot aside as it came within less than an inch of its target, so that it slid around the box like a rubber sole on wet rock. He tried again and again. He failed. "That's fucked," he remarked, sounding a damn sight less nonchalant than he felt. The only option remaining was to get out of the place before the fishermen who'd cast this glittering bait came for their catch. He stepped over the box, which continued to resolve its own conundrums. That, Harry reasoned, was a good sign indicating that the door to hell was not yet open. But he'd no sooner taken comfort in this thought than the walls of the passage proceeded to shake. Minor tremors escalated in seconds to what it felt like blows being delivered against the narrow space from all sides. Oh, thanks for the follow, the real Kiwis. All the items on the shelves that had not already been knocked off by Good's ghost now came down. The rest of the books, large and small, the specimen jars, and all other bizarrities in the dead man's collection. The walls on which the shelves had been secured were fracturing from floor to ceiling, and beams of cold light pierced the cracks. Harry knew from experience the nature of that light and the company it kept. A casual observer might have called it blue, but that missed all its nuances. This was a plague pallor, the color of grieving and despair. Harry didn't need to rely on his unscratchable itch because Kaz's handiwork was going crazy, warning him with every twitch and thrum that this was not a good place for him to be. He was in the process of taking the tattoo's advice, kicking aside all that had been cleared from the shelves so as to get back to the exit. Occasionally, the real Kiwis, occasionally. But as he did so, curiosity got the better of him, and for a moment he paused to look through the widening crack behind the shelves to his right. The gap in the wall was at least 1.5 feet wide and getting wider. There would be, he guessed, some unforeseeable horror coming through the passage between here and there. A glimpse was all he needed, enough to be able to report something even juicier than he'd anticipated to Norma. A game I'm playing now is Pathfinder Kingmaker. It's a RPG game. But to his surprise and mild disappointment, there were no demons in immediate view. What he could see through the shifting crack in the wall was a vast landscape. He took a quick glance around at the other cracks, but he saw only the same dead, cold light and heard only the sound of a harsh wind, which was blowing across the wilderness in front of him, raising up all manner of trash from the ground, nothing particularly hellish, just plastic bags, sheets of filthy paper, and brown dust. It looked like a war zone. He could see now the patterns of old, cobbled streets crisscrossing the wasteland, and in some places the rubble of an old building that had presumably once stood on the spot in question. In the middle distance, however, emerging from behind the slow veil of gray smoke, entire buildings, miraculously saved from the bombardment that had leveled everything else, still stood tall. In better times they had been beautiful, he knew, which surprised him. They looked like refugees from the old cities of Europe in their elegance. The gap in the wall had now opened to the width of a door, and Harry had advanced a step or two through it without even being conscious of having done so. It wasn't every day that a man got a glimpse of the pit. He was determined to take as much from this opportunity as he could. In his hunger to make sense of the entire vista, however, he had neglected to look down at his feet. Reading is something that I enjoy doing, and it keeps my brain a little more, alive, I guess, awake. I wouldn't say it's my favorite thing to do, but it's something fun. He was standing on the top step of a steep flight of stone steps, the base of which was erased by a yellow-gray mist. And from that mist, a figure was emerging. It was a naked man, his limbs scrawny, his belly a pot, the muscles of his chest covered by a layer of fat that resembled rudimentary breasts. But it was the man's head that drew Harry's astonished gaze. The man had clearly been the subject of a vicious experiment, its consequences so severe that Harry was astonished the patient still lived. The man's head had been sawed open through the bone, from the top of his skull, the base of his neck, slicing down the middle of his nose, mouth, and chin, leaving only his tongue entire, which lolled from the left side of the man's mouth. In order to keep bone and muscle from returning to their natural position, a thick rod of rusting iron, maybe 5 inches long, had been driven a finger's length down into the gap in the sundered head. The iron rod did more than simply separate the halves, however. It also, by some trick in its design, forced the half faces away from the frontal position, directing the man's gaze off at 45 degrees in each direction. This cruel surgery left its victim with a vaguely reptilian likeness, his bulging eyes staring out in different directions, and as a result, with every few steps he took, he turned his head one way or the other, so to fix his gaze again on Harry. How any human being's anatomy, much less his sanity, could have survived such vicious reconstruction was beyond comprehension. But survive he had, and with countless other parts of his anatomy also sliced and shaved and hammered and threaded. The man loped up the stairs toward Harry with distressing ease. as though this was a condition with which he had been born. And time to go, Harry said to himself, though his curiosity was a long way from being sated. He knew how he was going to seal the door, presuming the conventional method of reversing the work. Closing the box that had caused the connection to be made in the first place was not available. He'd use one of 3 pieces of magic. Universal incantations, magicians call them yuis, that would do the job without need of much preparation. The bisected man continued to lope up the stairs toward him when a penetrating voice rang out from the mist. "Felixson, hurry!" The bisected man froze. At last, the presence of this mutilated thing up on the steps made sense. It was not here alone. It was the property of some greater power, which had apparently quickened its ascent so that its form slowly became clearer. It was male, dressed in the ageless black vestments of the Cenobites, an infernal order of priests and priestesses. But this wasn't just any Cenobite going about his business of catching souls in a net of promised ecstasies. This was a figure in Hell's pantheon whom many who could not have named 3 angels could recognize. Somebody had even thought up a nickname for him that was quickly grown in popularity. He was called Pinhead, a name Harry now saw that was as insulting as it was appropriate. A pattern of grooves resembling the rigorous design of a chessboard, its squares as yet undifferentiated, had been carved into his sickly flesh, and where the lines crossed, the pins that had earned him his moniker, not pins at all, in truth, but hefty nails, had been hammered into bone and brain. "Rage Engage 92, what's up?" "Saying hi from Mixer." Harry didn't let the shock of recognition hold him for more than a moment. He took a backward step in the narrow, chaotic room behind him and uttered 5 words of a universal incantation. Imat, Thel, Mani, Fiedoth, Unnadar. The demonic hell priest heard the incantation and yelled up to his beast, "Take him, Felixson! Be quick!" Already the matter between worlds was knitting together in responses to Harry's instruction, a thickening veil between this world and hell. But Felixson, the bisected man, was quicker than the incantation. Before he even reached the top of the stairs, he leaped for the breach, his body tearing the veil open as it plunged through. Harry retreated to the door that took him into the empty gray room, but the morbid curiosity, one of the countless shades of curiosity Harry possessed, kept him from leaving the tiny hidden room before he had a closer look at the creature named Felixson, who now entered the narrow room and seemingly forgot his purpose the moment he did so. So now we see what's happened to Felixson in the afterlife. Rage Engage 92, thanks for the follow. Always happy to get Mixer followers. Harry watched as this halved man lowered his abominable head to scan the remnants of Good's library. And then, to Harry's astonishment, Felixson spoke, or came as close to doing so as his divided palate allowed. "Sparks, wow, thanks for the sparks." "Awesome. Books," he said, specks of spittle flying from his mouth. A kind of tenderness had come into his manner, and he went down onto his haunches, both sides of his head smiling. "Books?" Harry murmured, as Felixson lovingly picked over the litter of Karsten Good's secret library. Harry's voice was enough to break the creature from his reverie. Felixson dropped the book he had been lovingly examining and looked past the fallen cabinet at Harry. "You stay," Felixson said. Harry shook his head. "Nope." Harry raised his hand and slid it behind the bookcase that stood between him and Felixson, pushing with all his might. The room was far too narrow to allow the bookcase to fall very far. It struck the shelves on the wall, shedding the last of its contents. As it toppled, Harry pushed against the door, which had swung closed, and stepped out into the gray room. Behind him, he heard the noise of splintering wood as Felixson tore at the cabinet so as to get to the door. Harry turned back and slammed it closed. It locked automatically, and the invisible door illusion was instantly complete once more. It didn't remain that way for long, however. Seemingly possessed with an inhuman strength, Felixson thumped against the door with intent. It flew open, splintering off its hinges. "Die now, detective," Felixson said, stepping out of the small room. Before Harry could process Felixson's impossible knowledge of his profession, a light within the narrow room blazed with sudden ferocity, illuminating everything with the deranged lucidity of lightning blasts. As if punctuating the display, A hook-headed chain leaped out of the tiny room and whipped toward Harry, whining as it flew in his direction. Felix's response was to instantly drop to the ground, doing his pitiful best to protect his head as he did so. Meanwhile, the tattoo Kaz had recently added, because Kaz had stated, "You fucking earned it, man," was itching wildly, its unpleasant news flash unequivocal. This is a death threat, but Harry wasn't the hook's target. Its bullseye was the door behind him, and the hook and chain threw themselves against it with considerable force. The door slammed shut, and the hook snaked down to the handle, wrapping the chain around the mottled metal knob several times. Finally, interest gave way to a more level-headed panic, and it was then that Harry scrambled to the door and attempted to pull it open. Just like in the movies, they all do that all too late. He succeeded in getting it open a few inches before he felt a sharp pain in his neck and a rush of wet heat, which divided at his shoulders, running down over his back and chest. An unseen hook had pierced him, but Harry paid it no heed and continued trying to haul the door open, gritting his teeth against the pain he knew would come when he tore himself free. Loosing a stream of profanities, Harry pulled on the door, but the hook in his shoulder dug in deeper, and then the chain to which it was attached tightened, and Harry was hauled away from the door and any hope of escape. "Do not bother to try to run, Harry D'Amour," said the Cenobite, releasing Harry from the chain's grip, "for there is nowhere to go." "You know my name?" Oop. "And you, no doubt, mine. Tell me, Harry D'Amour, what words you've heard whispered that have moved you to put aside the comforts of the commonplace to live, as I am told you live, engaged in constant conflicts against hell." "I think you got the wrong Harry D'Amour." "Your modesty nauseates me. Be boastful while you have the breath for it. You are Harry D'Amour, private investigator, scourge of hell." "Sounds to me like those nails are touching too much gray matter." "You are a magnificent cliché, and yet you've sown hope in too much undeserving dirt. Against all expectations it grew and spread, and wherever the chance of its survival was slimmest, it prospered. Your gift to the damned and despairing, a gift I shall now extinguish." The Cenobite made a gesture with his left hand, and another hook and chain came through the door, this one weaving over the boards like a snake and then suddenly leaping at D'Amour's chest. Harry felt the design of interwoven talismans Kaz had inked on his chest convulse, and the hook was thrown back with such force that it slammed against the opposing wall, burying the sharpened point into the plaster. "Inspiring," the Cenobite said. "What else have you learned?" "Hopefully enough to keep me from looking like that poor shit," D'Amour said, referring to the still deferent Felixen. "Appearances deceive. You should know that you are in the presence of one of your world's most renowned magicians." What? The words suddenly struck a chord in D'Amour's memory. Over the last several years, the world's most powerful magicians had been systematically and ritually slaughtered. Nobody knew why. Harry, acting like some kind of detective, was beginning to put the pieces together. "Felixen?" he said. "I know that name. That's Theodore Felixen?" "Last of the High Circle." "The fuck happened to him?" I spared him his life. Oh boy. If that's what salvation looks like, I'll pass. "War is but a continuation of diplomacy by alternate means." "War? Against who? A bunch of pampered magicians?" "Perhaps you'll find out. Perhaps not. Thank you for accepting your bait by opening the box." "Bait? This was a fucking setup?" "You should be honored, though I fail to see what sets you apart from the rest of the vermin. Your reputation precedes you. I propose a test. I'll leave Felixen here to do away with you. Should he fail at his task, I shall return to you with an offer you dare not refuse." The Hell Priest turned to leave. You want me to fight this crippled mess?" D'Amour said. "As I said, appearances deceive." "Pietros Pan 95, what's up?" You want to hear? You want to hear the Hell Priest talk again? Let me find an epic line of his from this book. Okay, here we go. All right, this is for you, Pietrus Pan 95. Where is it? War is but a continuation of diplomacy by alternate means. That's a pretty epic line. Clive Barker is a pretty awesome writer. As I said, okay. With that, the Cenobite unclipped a machete and a hook from his belt and threw them down before Felixson, who quickly snatched them up, feeling the weight of them. A mischievous double grin, all the more grotesque for its simple sincerity, appeared on his broken face. Hook! He shrieked in excitement to the Cenobite, who was making his way back to the passageway into Karsten Good's hidden library. You never give. He was working hard to shape the word. Hook. To the victor I will bestow more spoils. There was, briefly, a noise like very distant thunder. Then it was gone, and so Harry sensed, was the Hell Priest. Just the two of us then, Harry said, and before Felixson could move to attack, Harry took out his gun and fired twice into Felixson's heart. The bullets put 2 holes in Felixson's heart, but they did not kill him, and the magician's mouths turned upward in an arrogant sneer. Stupid Demore, can't kill Felixson, not never. What's up, Raziel? The book is here. Right there. That's what we're reading. You say that like it's a good thing. Is best. You are so wrong, Demore said. You die. Find out who is wrong, Felixson said, flicking the length of chain toward Harry like a whip as he came toward him. Okay, just a quick review. Felixson, for people who might have walked in, Felixson was a world-renowned magician, and there was a bunch of magicians trying to defeat this Hell Priest that everyone knows as Pinhead. But Pinhead got him, and so he's dead, and now he's serving Pinhead. That's where we're at now. Felixson pointed toward Harry and spoke incomprehensibly to the book. Yeah. It flew from Felixson's hands, came at Harry, and dug into his groin, cutting through tender flesh and exiting out through a second spot, 2 wounds for the price of 1. Harry howled in pain. Felixson wrenched the chain back and tore through the flesh of Harry's thigh. The hook returned to him, and he addressed it once again. Once again, the hook came at Harry and caught his groin in the opposite flank. This is a horror story. Raziello. Felixson wrenched the chain back. Where was it? Good now, Felixson said. Only 1 more hook, then bye to little Demore. Harry barely had time to react to Felixson's promise of unmanning. His attention had been drawn to the door out into the passageway. It was shaking violently, as though stampeding animals were trying to break through. What is... asked, his attention now focused on the door as well. I don't have a fucking clue, Harry said, clinging to consciousness. See ya, Raziel. Thanks for stopping by. The door wasn't going to hold much longer against the beating it was taking. The wood around the hinges and lock was cracking now, throwing off splinters and flakes of paint. Who there? Felixson said. I killed Demore, if you come. Felixson growled and jerked the chain back, tearing the hook from Demore's other thigh in one clean motion. The veins in Demore's neck bulged as he unleashed a guttural, gurgling groan. You see? Felixson screamed at the door as he ran an affectionate palm down over the lethal curve of the blood-drenched hook. Felixson chattered a third incantation, and again the hook-headed chain began snaking its way toward Harry like a slothful cobra. Its head held high as it wove toward Harry's crotch. A panicky collage of sexual images broke through Harry's terror. Masturbating behind the gym at St. Dominic's with Piper and Freddie. The girl, was it Janet or Janice? He'd fucked on the overnight bus to New York. And the weeping adulteresses who were eager to sin a little more by offering to double Harry's rate. All of this and 100 other memories ran through his head as the instrument idled its weaving way toward his manhood. And then, without warning, it ceased its leisurely approach and struck. Harry wasn't about to let this thing unman him without a fight. He waited until the hook was an inch from the front of his pants and then reached down and grabbed the hook with his right hand and the chain just behind the hook with his left. The chain instantly started to thrash wildly to free itself of Harry's grip. Stupid! Felix yelled. You worse make! Shut the fuck up, Harry yelled at Felixson. Ass-licking cretin! Kill Demore! Felixson yelled to the serpentine chains. Harry's sweaty hands were steadily losing their grip on the blood-encrusted metal. A few seconds more and it would be in him. The hook inched closer to his crotch as his sweat-slicked palms failed him more with every moment. Castration was imminent. Harry saw in his mind's eye the hook digging into the meat of his cock. He gripped the chain with the last of his strength and loosed a primal howl of protest. And as if on cue, the door finally succumbed to those who wanted to be inside. The lock flew off and the door was thrown sideways, slamming so hard against the adjacent wall that large gobs of plaster rained down in the room like a dusty hailstorm. Harry felt a blast of icy air break against his face. Harry's friend the string yard had broken past the sealed door and was with him once again, but this time Harry sensed the yard wasn't alone. Unfortunately, the opening of the door had not distracted the butcher's hook from its ambitions. It still intended to gouge out Harry's groin, and even Harry's white-knuckled grip could not prevent the chain from pushing closer to him by increments. Harry felt the cold presence of a spirit moving around his hand, its coolness welcome. The cooling presence refreshed his weary body, dried his palms, and put strength back into his sinews. He pushed the serpent chain away from his groin a good 6 inches, then threw the thing to the ground and put the hook beneath his knee. "Take that, fucker," Harry said. The snaking chain was far from happy with this new arrangement. Even trapped beneath Harry's weight, it still tried to slide itself out. It was only a matter of seconds, Harry knew, before it succeeded, for the wounds on his thighs were bleeding copiously, and whatever was left of his strength would be gone very soon. But the ghost's presences calmed and comforted him. He was no longer alone in this battle. He had allies. He just couldn't see them. It appeared, however, that Felixson could. The man's eyes had swelled up, and he laid his gaping head first on his left shoulder, then on his right, moving around on the spot where he now stood as he attempted to assess the strength of his new enemies, talking to them all the while. "Felixson will catch and make eat you," he reeled around, snatching up at the invisible spirits, muttering curses or incantations, or both, as he tried to catch hold of just one of the phantoms, swirling around the room. Oh, Harry's got backup. With its summoner's attention redirected, the chain slowly lost its will to act, and its thrashing died down. Very cautiously, Harry took his knee off the hook and picked it up. As he moved, the adrenaline shock left his body, and his lightheadedness returned. This time he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to hold on to consciousness. He had help, however, as one of the cold spirits, apparently sensing his distress, wove through his body like an ethereal balm. Though the pain was not diminished, the spirit coaxed him away from it and into some chamber of his soul where he had never been before. It was numinous, this place, and filled with little games to enchant his pain-wearied body. Then the presence inside him seemed to speak. Harry heard it say, "Get ready." And as that final syllable of its utterance reverberated in him, the balmy dream evaporated, and Harry was back in the room with Felixson, who, impossible as it was to believe, seemed to have gone a hell of a lot crazier. He had some invisible thing pinned against the opposite wall and was tearing into it. In its agony, the unseen victim was releasing a high-pitched shriek. "Tell dead friends," Felixson said, his speech decaying as his frenzy grew. "Tell them all dead, how you? Tell to them Felixson will shit them. To messing in hell's business. Never. Hear? Tell." He twisted his fingers in the empty air, and his voice rose an octave. "I hear no tell." Though Harry couldn't see the phantoms, he could feel them and their agitation. Felixson's commands only seemed to make them angry. The whole room began to vibrate, the old boards throwing themselves back and forth across the room in their fury, opening cracks in the plaster every time they struck the wall. Harry watched as his allies dislodged several pieces of ceiling plaster, and in the clouds of dust that rose from the floor when they fell, he seemed to see the ghosts, or at least their vague outlines. Cracks appeared in the ceiling, zigzagging across the plaster. The bare bulbs swung back and forth, making Felixson's shadow cavort as the phantoms moved around the room, their hunger to destroy this place and Felixson palpable. It was clear that they were working to pull the room apart. Plaster dust was filling the room like a white fog. Felixson turned his gaze back at Harry. "Harry D'Amour I blame! He pays!" Felixson reached for the chain, and Harry watched as the plaster fog was swept aside by a phantom, its descent mirrored by a second phantom coming from the opposite direction and intersecting at the chain. The chain, struck at the precise spot where the ghosts crossed, blew apart, leaving a length of perhaps 18 inches of loose metal still dangling from the hook. The blow had formed a wound in Felixson's brow. The magician was unprepared for this. He cursed and wiped away blood from his right eye. Then, two more phantoms converged not only on the remainder of the chain, but directly onto the hand that held it. Before Felixson could loose the chain from his grasp, the spirits converged on his hand. When they met, fragments of flesh, bone, and metal blew outward. With Felixson wounded and unarmed, the spirits took it upon themselves to continue the destruction of Karsten Good's den of iniquity. The whole place rocked as the phantom shook its foundations. The bulb in the middle of the room flared with unnatural brightness and just as quickly burned out. Harry realized it was time to move. He was perhaps 2 strides from the door when the second tattoo Kaz had given him, a warning sigil in the middle of his back, sent out a pulse that spread throughout his body. He swung around just in time to throw himself out of the way of Felixson, whose lips were drawn back to expose jagged, flesh-shredding teeth. Felixson's teeth snapped in the air where Harry's head had been 2 seconds before, and the momentum of the lunge carried Felixson forward, slamming him into the wall beside the door. Harry didn't give Felixson an opportunity to go after him a second time. He was out through the door and into the passageway. The ghosts were in a crazed state, and they were everywhere, tossing themselves back and forth. They slammed into the walls like invisible hammers. The plaster had been cleared off by now, exposing the wooden slats beneath. There was a din of destruction from the other end of the passageway, which suggested the stairs were being taken apart with the same gusto as the walls. But the dust and the darkness conspired to limit Harry's sight to a foot in front of his face, and no more. Despite the sounds of unmaking before him, he had no choice but to risk it. Meanwhile, the floorboards groaned and twisted, spitting out the nails that had held them in place. Harry ventured over them as fast as he dared, past the sling room, which was now a wall of suffocating dust, and on over the cavorting boards. The wooden slats were succumbing to the strikes of the hammer-bodied spirits, even more quickly than the plaster. Harry crossed his arms in front of his face to protect it from the splinters that pierced the air. He was walking blind. For a third time, the cool presence intervened, entering Harry and speaking in the blood that thundered in Harry's ears. Back now. Hey, smacked. Pipe traumatic syndrome disorder? Don't know what that is, but I'll look that up later. Harry responded instantly, and as he jumped back, Felixson charged past him, his mouth vast, and from it a solid howl emerged, which suddenly dropped away. The stairs were gone, and something about the way Felixson's howl had diminished told Harry's instincts that there was now a void beneath the house into which the Cenobite's lapdog had been dispatched. Judging by Felixson's faraway howl, it was deep, and there was likely no way anyone would ever be able to climb out of it, or rather when the house folded up and fell. Harry turned back in the direction he'd come. He quickly and carefully headed to the back room, trying not to focus on the passageway as it collapsed beneath him, the boards digging away into the blackness over which he was leaping. About the pipe? All right. By the time he returned to the room, the plaster dust had almost cleared, sucked away by emptiness below. There was only a single unreliable patchwork of wooden slats left between Harry and the hole. But at least now he had a clear view of his last hope and his only target. Yeah, sure, yeah, send me a link. I'll see what's up with that. Only target, the window. Trusting his feet to know their business, he crossed the room without incident. There was a ledge, perhaps 4 floorboards in front of the window, but it didn't look as though it was going to be there for long. The boards had already lost most of their nails. Harry started to pull at the blackout fabric that had been secured to the window. It had clearly been nailed to the frame by an obsessive, but it had been done several years before. Harry guessed because the fabric, though thick, had begun to rot through after several summers of extreme humidity, and when he pulled at it, the material tore like paper. Hey, thanks, Smacked. Host for shows you like? Yeah. Cool, thanks, Japandi Jones. Appreciate it, man. Let's see. Harry started to... Where was I? There we are. The light of the outside world came flooding into the room. It wasn't direct sunlight, but it was bright nonetheless, and it was more than welcome. Harry peered out of the window. It was a long way down, and there was nothing on either side. A drain pipe would have been adequate. A fire escape would have made a climb down plausible, but no. He was going to have to jump and hope for the best. He pulled on the window's edge, trying to raise it, but it was sealed shut, so he turned around and tore up one of the floorboards, making his ledge even narrower. As he turned back toward the window with his weapon, he caught sight of something from the corner of his eye, and glanced back to see that he was no longer alone in the room. Awesome! Thanks, Japandi. Let's see. Battered, bloody, and covered in dust, his teeth bared, his eyes narrowed to slits of fury, Pinhead's rabid dog, Felixen, stood staring at Harry. Far though Felixen had surely fallen, he had claimed his way back up, intent on finishing the bloody business between them. You've done some dumb fucking things, Damore, Harry said to himself. Felixen came at him suddenly, the boards he had sprung from splintering as he leaped. Harry threw the wood he'd been carrying at the window, shattering the glass, and put all his effort into getting out. A crowd of people had gathered out on the sidewalk. Harry caught a few fragments of the things they were yelling. Something about him breaking his neck, something about getting a ladder or a mattress or a sheet. But despite all the suggestions, nobody moved to help in case they missed the moment when Harry jumped. And 2 seconds later, he could have, had he been free to do so. But Felixen wasn't about to lose his prey. With one last bound, the living monstrosity cleared the chasm between them, and caught hold of Harry's leg. Digging his fingers, their strength clearly enhanced by the merciless fusing of metal and flesh, deep into the bleeding holes in Harry's thighs. Though Harry was in tremendous pain, he didn't waste the energy he had by voicing it. "All right, fuckhead," he said. "You're coming with me." And with that, he threw himself out of the window. Felixen held on to Harry as far as the window ledge, and then perhaps out of a fear of being seen, he let go. Harry landed hard on a patch of asphalt. He was familiar enough with the sound of breaking bones to know that he surely shattered a few. But before he could ask any of the onlookers for a ride to the nearest hospital, the house gave up a long growl of surrender and then collapsed, folding up and dropping down through what was left of the structure, the walls flying apart in places, and in other entire sections of wetted brick toppling in mounds. Wetted brick, that's interesting. It happened with astonishing speed, the entire structure dropping away into the earth in less than a minute. Its collapse finally releasing a dense gray-brown cloud of dust. As the wall succumbed, so did Harry's body. A wave of shudders passed through him, and once again his sight was invaded by a pulsing blankness. It did not retreat this time, but pressed forward from all directions. The world around him narrowed to a remote circle as though he were looking at it through the wrong end of a telescope. The pulse of pain maintained rhythm, with that of the invading nullity, all moving to the beat of his drumming heart. Very far off, in the place from which his consciousness was departing, Harry saw somebody approaching him through the crowd. A bald, pale, diminutive man with a stare so penetrating that he could feel its intensity even though he was almost a world away. The man moved through the crowd with uncommon ease, as though some invisible presence cleared the way for him. The sight of the man lent Harry's besieged senses a reason to hold on a little longer, to resist the encroaching emptiness that threatened to erase the place where he walked. "Thank you, sir, Japandi Jones, or ma'am, Japandi Jones." Much as he wanted to know who this intense Lilliputian was, Harry's mind was closing down. Harry drew a ragged breath, determined at least to tell this man his name, but he had no need. "We should leave now, Mr. Damore," the man said, "while everyone is still distracted." The man then reached out and took gentle hold of Harry's hand. When their fingers made contact, a wave of forgiving warmth passed into Harry's hand, and the string of his wounds retreated. He was comforted as a babe in its mother's arms, and with that thought, the world went black. And it is here, my friends, that I am going to call this, for I have something else we're going to be doing shortly. Once again, this is the Scarlet Gospels, little rated R thing for people who might not have known. It's a horror book, so. Yes, we're going to move on to a little something I do every Sunday, which is French language learning. Total 180 from this. But it's a thing I'm doing to keep myself kind of accountable with wanting to learn the language. So we're going to move on to that next. So for anyone who stopped by for the reading, thank you so much for coming. And thanks for the follows. I appreciate that. And all the information you guys gave me, I really appreciate that. I'm going to go AFK for a bit and then set a few things up. And then we'll move on to French learning. All right. Burb.